Out of crisis and catastrophe comes opportunity, yeah. For real change in the world economy, to reduce vulnerability and inequality. So we coming together virtually to expand opportunities for developing countries. At UNCTAD 15, we're solving trade issues, youth issues and gender issues too. Civil society and creative industries are part of the call to bring prosperity for all. Small island, big ideas, much more than the beach. Small country, big reach, touching the world virtually. We might be small, but proud people standing tall. Creative and hardworking, we bring Barbados to you. You can't come to Barbados, we bring Barbados to you. If you can't fly to Barbados, we take Barbados to you. If you can't get to Barbados, we get Barbados to you. UNCTAD, Barbados welcomes you.
Hello everyone. It is my great pleasure to bring greetings from Barbados to all of our friends, the representatives of civil society from all across the globe. Let me begin by thanking the members of the Facilitation Committee, ably led by Richard Jones of the Caribbean Policy Development Center, for their work on the program and the agenda for the Civil Society Forum. I am sure that your discussions over the next 3 days will be robust and full of substance, and that your input will enrich the wider negotiations and decisions of UNCTAD 15. Our thanks also go to Chantel Monroe-Knight, the national lead organizer, for her guidance, as well as to UNCTAD's Secretariat's focal points in Geneva for their assistance in this entire process. My friends, this is the second time that Barbados has hosted a major United Nations conference. The first, of course, being the Global Conference on the Sustainable Development of Small Island Developing States, which took place in 1994. That conference marked the beginning of a remarkable journey on which we are really still very much embarked, a journey to gain recognition for SIDS as a separate category of states within their own peculiar needs and inherent vulnerabilities, which of course we know are deserving of special attention. Let us remember that small island developing states constitute almost 1/4 of the world's nation states. Our hope for UNCTAD 15, meeting, of course, at this unique and profoundly disruptive moment in time, is that this conference is as catalytic and transformative for the international community as was SIDS 94 for small islands. I mention this history not as a casual reference en passant, but rather to draw attention to the vital strategic role which NGOs, and particularly Caribbean NGOs, played at SIDS 94. These are facts that are unfortunately not sufficiently well known or appreciated. On their own initiative and with little support from international donors, civil society organizations from Barbados and the Caribbean, supported by their global partners, took over our entire community college campus, with permission of course, and set up what they aptly named the Village of Hope. For 2 weeks then, they conducted their forum through workshops, briefings, and discussions, examining the issues and challenges associated with the prevailing development models and proposing an alternative action plan. They mounted an exhibition, SUSTEC 94, to promote dozens of ideas and examples of sustainable development for island communities, showcasing indigenous, traditional, and innovative approaches, and displaying over 250 examples of solutions to worldwide problems. Over 150 NGOs were accredited, over 1/3 of them from small island developing states. My friends, it is fair to say that the Village of Hope created quite a buzz at the conference and was visited not just by delegates, but by thousands of local Barbadians. I remember it only too well. The government of the day paid public tribute to the active participation of civil society in the conference, and recognize that its outcomes would be more difficult to sustain if they were not enriched by the contributions of NGOs, and in particular, those of small island developing states. The growth in organization and activism of Caribbean NGOs, especially on environmental and sustainable development issues, derives much of its impetus from that critical UN process back in 1994. Today, almost 3 decades later, as Barbados once again undertakes the responsibility of hosting a major UN conference, albeit virtually, we draw inspiration from that past experience, and we look forward once again to the active contribution of civil society organizations to the outcomes of UNCTAD 15. Frankly, there has perhaps never been a more critical time for your voices to be heard. In Barbados, we have long recognized that good ideas do not reside exclusively in the minds of elected representatives, and nor therefore should all decision-making be the purview of the few. At the local level, good governance requires the involvement of all citizens in the process of nation building. We cannot educate our citizens and then treat them as though their opinions do not count. For it is people who must be at the center of truly participatory democracy. And when people act confident in the knowledge that they are both seen and heard, their ability to network, exchange ideas, and share best practices at the national, regional, and international levels is greatly amplified. That is why we take the inclusion of civil society very seriously, and why we welcome your involvement in UNCTAD 15. My country, Barbados, owes much of its political and social stability to the mechanism of our social partnership, which was institutionalized in harsh economic times in the early 1990s. It is a tripartite arrangement where government, the private sector, and the unions consult together to tackle major issues of the day and to agree on strategies and actions that are in the national interest. Less than a year after my government came into office, the social partnership was expanded through the formation of a social justice committee whose membership includes a range of NGOs and community-based organizations. Civil society organizations in Barbados are therefore very much at the table, and through the process, their recommendations and concerns are transmitted to the social partnership, or indeed, when the circumstances require, directly to Cabinet. For 2 weeks leading up to the opening of UNCTAD 15, we will be streaming 5 forums from our production studios in Barbados and in Geneva as official pre-events of the conference. In Barbados, we are filming on a set that recreates a typical Barbadian village with its corner shop and its chattel house. I know that in these times of pain and desperation, it is difficult to think positively of the future. Trust me, I know that. But I ask you, as you meet to dialogue and consult, please try to draw inspiration from these Barbadian symbols of resilience and community and turn your forum into another village of hope. For this, my friends, is the place where we would have had you been here physically. I say to you simply that use this opportunity to advance your ideas and to create those things that we believe need to be able to move the global population and not just the 200 governments or so that exist in this world. I have every confidence that you have it with you. And believe you me, I say to you, the fact that you have not visited this time, do not let the future pass you without coming and spending some time with us. Because, my friends, we so want to be able to give you that warm Barbadian welcome that would have been yours had it not for this pandemic. See you soon, and all the very best in your deliberations. Thank you.
Members of the civil society, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I welcome you to the Civil Society Forum of the 15th Conference of UNCTAD, whose theme, From Inequality and Vulnerability to Prosperity for All, is now more urgent than ever. This is only my 2nd week as UNCTAD Secretary General. With time, you will get to know me. But I take this opportunity now to assure you that I come with a great sense of responsibility, deeply aware of the incredible testing times, that we are in. We stand at a critical moment in the history of multilateralism, in the history of the United Nations, and in the history of UNCTAD itself. The COVID-19 pandemic has proved to be one of the largest challenges of our generation, producing big setbacks in the hard-won progress made in combating poverty and inequality and in advancing sustainable development. This crisis is not over, and many developing regions are seriously facing the prospect of another lost decade, exactly at the time when efforts towards achieving the 2030 agenda should be coming into full gear. The work ahead is great, as shown by our Trade and Development Report, released last week, where we say that we are witnessing a very divergent global recovery, with advanced countries growing and vaccinating at rates that are multiples of those in the developing world. In a word, if we follow the current trajectory, this is a recovery that will leave many people behind, a recovery that will not comply with our values and mandate here at UNCTAD. This will not be prosperity for all. Behind this divergence lurks one of the greatest lessons of this pandemic. Where there is inequality, there is fragility. And when shocks come, gaps widen, and those that were already suffering suffer the most. In a world where shocks are increasingly common, we must see that the pre-pandemic business as usual was leading us only to the mirage of progress, to development that was temporary and therefore unsustainable. That is why we include now more than ever the word resilience in our SDGs goals, because shocks should not shock us any longer. Dear friends, we need a new path forward, and this is a path in which each and every one of us must feel empowered to help and participate. This includes you in the civil society, one of our key stakeholders, both at large and through our conference. Because if we want new solutions, we need new voices, new perspectives, and new debates. I am aware, as I think you are too, of the special role UNCTAD is called to play in the response to this deeply unequal crisis. UNCTAD is an institution that is uniquely mandated to channel the voices of developing countries around the world, of developing countries not as debtors or as passive recipients of aid, but as proactive members of the multilateral community. The international responses to the COVID-19 crisis are still emerging, are still being negotiated and agreed to, and all of us are called upon to participate with conviction, integrity, and devotion. Because let me be clear about this, an international response without these voices would be incomplete, insufficient, and unfair. We need to build back a better future that is accompanied by a new narrative on trade, on investment, on debt, on technology, on a development that is truly sustainable, that fights inequalities and leaves no one behind. As argued by Secretary General Guterres, we need nothing less than a new social contract, a task for which we need to fully harness the collective wisdom and experience of civil society in development, to ensure that all voices are heard and resonate in the halls where intergovernmental deliberations are taking place. Dear friends, civil society is a strong partner of UNCTAD, key to the implementation of our mandate, and an active contributor to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. During the next 3 days, you will be meeting and discussing important topics such as multilateralism, trade, technology, and systemic reform. I look forward to your deliberations on all these important matters and to your collective contribution to UNCTAD 15 through this forum's declaration. Before I finish, I wish to thank the Caribbean Policy Development Center, led by Mr. Richard Jones, the host civil society organization of this forum, for successfully preparing this important event. Thank you, Richard. I also wish to thank the members of the International Civil Society Facilitation Committee for their contribution in designing a program that is of great importance, relevance, and precision. Lastly, my gratitude also goes out to Prime Minister Mia Amor Motley of Barbados for supporting this conference and for the excellent collaboration in the preparatory process towards the Civil Society Forum. Rest assured that under the wise presidency of our host country, Barbados, and the Prime Minister leadership and my personal commitment, your contribution will enrich the legacy of Bridgetown. Dear delegates, as I said at the beginning, this is only my second week as UNCTAD Secretary General, but I can assure you that it is my strong intention to strengthen our relationship with civil society and to empower your contribution to our work. I hope we soon will have the time to meet again in person and to get to know each other better. I therefore ask and call on you, but I also ask and call on UNCTAD to work together on the many challenges the world faces by building on our common expertise, our common goals and efforts, and by empowering our unique mandate to help. I thank you all.
Distinguished delegates, representatives of civil society, ladies and gentlemen, from a warm and sunny Barbados, I welcome each and every one joining us virtually for the commencement of the Civil Society Forum. This is one of 6 forums being held from the 22nd to the 24th of September at the 15th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. In 2019, the Secretary General of the United Nations called for a decade of action to meet the Sustainable Development Goals in recognition that progress was lagging in both speed and scale. This progress was further compounded in 2020 with the detection of COVID-19. The resultant pandemic has wreaked havoc on a deeply unbalanced global economic system, emphasizing social and economic gaps within and across communities and countries. Steady gains made in achieving the SDGs are being eroded by impacts of the pandemic, loss of jobs, decline in investment, reduction in educational activity, increased financial burden, and overall greater vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities derive not only from unpredictable markets and social instability, but also from a fragile global environment weakened by climate change. Small island developing states like Barbados have long been challenged by climate change. In recent years, there have been record numbers of natural disasters, including hurricanes, droughts, and fires across the world. The developmental challenges from sea level rise, altered rainfall patterns, and storm surges threaten to reverse progress to achieving sustainable development. As small island developing states, these are challenges we face even as the business of global tourism becomes increasingly challenging. Efforts must be placed on the prioritization of adaptation strategies, resilience building initiatives, and adequate financing mechanisms to support small island developing states and developing countries as we adapt to increased incidence of natural disasters and risks to coastal and food security infrastructure. We recognize that this can only be achieved if there is global political consensus for innovative mechanisms that engage and foster responsible climate-friendly policy responses for those vulnerable developing nations impacted by climate-related change. Technical support and critical analysis is needed to elevate and sustain emerging efforts in developing countries towards sustainable green growth and blue economy development policies. We call on the international community to prioritize the creation and implementation of policies that support the provision of technical and financial assistance to small island developing states and other developing countries, given the resultant high economic, social, and environmental costs to countries impacted by climate change. When faced with deficits, developing countries, including small island developing states, seek financing to support fiscal objectives. These challenges arise out of the inability to service debt obligations while providing the essential social and economic services our populations require. This can lead to a number of issues, including debt overhang, which could deter investors who anticipate an increase in taxes. Debt service costs paid to developed countries and private companies can hinder essential government spending, forcing an untenable choice between paying salaries and debt repayment while in the midst of a global pandemic. In the Caribbean, debt service costs accounted for an estimated 7% of GDP, 27% of government revenue, and 9% of exports of goods and services over the period 2001 to 2016. Debt continues to absorb a significant portion of government's revenue, limiting fiscal space and therefore the ability to address critical social development concerns. It ultimately hinders civil society's impact due to limited investment in social programs. We support civil society in its call for a clear commitment to institutional processes to support monitoring and reporting on the various initiatives. UNCTAD must actively monitor the implementation of relevant processes that directly relate to its work portfolio, particularly on debt, responsible borrowing and lending, and official development assistance flows, amongst others. As a result of these and other structural and systemic challenges, civil society organizations across the Global South and their northern counterparts seek to place the urgent need for debt and international financial architecture reform on the table for critical examination. Urgent action is required to halt the looming economic and social collapse in small island developing states and developing countries generally post-COVID. We support civil society's call to implement dependable, inclusive, democratic, and adaptable measures to determine how and when countries can access development assistance to allow for the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals and the Development Agenda. These measures must include the establishment and operationalization of a new multidimensional Development Vulnerability Index that uses not only quantitative but also qualitative criteria to determine who should access assistance. As we urge UNCTAD to strengthen its role in this area, civil society is committed to establishing mechanisms for follow-up work and actions post-UNCTAD 15 to support efforts at enhancing accountability. One of the outcomes the Civil Society Forum will pursue is consensus on a roadmap for work related to UNCTAD activities, including a strengthened internal civil society institutional framework that facilitates ongoing civil society dialogue and the sharing of information. The government of Barbados has long recognized the intrinsic value of social dialogue as a vehicle for social and economic development. Barbados' social partnership model is comprised of workers' organizations, private enterprise, and government, and was born out of the economic crisis of the early 1990s. Expanding on this, the Social Justice Committee was established in 2019 at the national level. Through this formal mechanism, non-governmental organizations and civil society organizations take their rightful place in the discussion and decision-making process. As a government, we support the integral role of civil society organizations at the national and international level. We are heartened by the participation from Barbados and the wider Caribbean in this process. Their contributions to the development of the civil society forums and UNCTAD 15 has been vital. These efforts are reflective of the theme of this conference, from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. This theme aims at providing the platform to re-energize and refocus development efforts and commitments that must be reflected in our work. Therefore, we urge your commitment to taking decisive actions to ensure equality in strengthening development capacity across countries, equitable vaccine distributions, providing debt relief, and to including civil society in the multilateral space. While the COVID-19 pandemic has undeniably provided serious setbacks to development gains across countries and communities, I expect UNCTAD 15 to lead the way in providing truly transformative outcomes that guide the path from inequalities and vulnerabilities to prosperity for all. I thank you.
Another one of the critical issues that we're going to be discussing here within the Civil Society Forum is the issue of climate justice and sustainability. If you are small island developing states, then you know that the issues of climate change are especially acute. When we also talk about our blue and green economy, then we know how relevant this discussion is. So we want to ensure that we have a framework which not only speaks to the issues of climate change, but understands the interconnectivity between climate change and human rights, which ensures that there's an equitable framework for reducing the impact of climate change.
Welcome, delegates. I am Ramona Smart, the president of Soroptimist International of Barbados. Soroptimist International is a global organization which, for the past 100 years, has been enabling, empowering, and educating women and girls all over the world. Here in Barbados, the elderly are important to us. We value the contributions they have made to the development of our nation. With this in mind, Soroptimist International of Barbados established the Soroptimist Senior Citizens Village some 50 years ago. At this village, our seniors reside in peaceful, tranquil, and safe surroundings. Also, within the compound, we have an activity center where our seniors gather to socialize and engage in activities which encourage active aging. From this conference, we are looking forward to some strong outcomes which will help Barbados to maintain the social gains it has made so far among the elderly. We welcome and do enjoy your conference.
We here in Barbados are extremely proud to be not only the first Caribbean island, but also small island developing state to be hosting UNCTAD. For this reason, I, Amanda Emptage, representing the Bajan Firefighters Charity, would like to extend the heartiest Bajan welcome. Additionally, we hope that these discussions will aid in reforming developmental policies which will seek to foster resilience and equality for developing and developed states alike, especially amidst COVID-19.
Welcome to Barbados. My name is Kevin Mallon and I'm a member of the Barbados Association of Non-Governmental Organizations. This is the 15th United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Civil Society Forum, and we hope that throughout these days, we will continue to send strong yet inclusive message. We are dependent on you for strong outcomes. As a small island developing state, climate change is beyond an important issue. We not only see the reality, but live the reality every day. We hope that you, throughout these days, will continue to send a strong message about the need for responsive climate action and inclusive trade policies. Barbados is beautiful, but as a country we suffer from unfair, high, and crippling debt. The time to act is now. The times are unprecedented. We need serious action. Welcome to Barbados once again. We wish you were here with us.
Welcome, delegates. I'm Christopher Jokes, Director of the Barbados Council for the Disabled. The Council is partnering with all sectors of society on a journey from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. Barbados is beautiful, but as a country, we suffer from unfair trade rules and high debt. Civil society is an important voice to provide alternative development paths and hold governments accountable. Therefore, we are counting on you, my friends, to help us send strong messages about the change we need.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, civil society. We're so happy welcoming you at the Civil Society Forum of UNCTAD 15. We have created or opened a platform for you to have interactive sessions, but also being able to have bilateral meetings, chat group, and what have you. And we've worked closely with CPDC, Richard Jones, to make all of this a very nice 3 days event, and look forward to interacting and hearing your important messages that we could bring forward later on. So wishing you a pleasant 3 days. We're following you and look forward to seeing you on Friday again. Over to Barbados from Geneva.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to all of you joining us here today. It is my distinct pleasure as host, organization, and chair of the UNCTAD 15 Advisory International Civil Society Facilitating Group to welcome you virtually to Barbados, the first small island developing state to host this important UNCTAD event. The hosting of UNCTAD 15 in a small island developing state offers a critical opportunity to ground the discussions in the present and future realities of some of the most vulnerable countries and their populations. I'm delighted that you're here with us to participate and share in the Civil Society Forum. It speaks to the value of and the commitment to our sector's work, especially in these unprecedented times. Ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted every corner of the globe. Many countries are now faced with increasing economic pressures due to the consequent collapse in tax revenues, business activities, and commodity supply chains, leading to much economic and social instability and uncertainty. At this time, it is recognized that while the pandemic has brought with it increasing challenges, emerging and developing economies were already facing constrained circumstances. The issues of debt, climate change, high unemployment, and the need for economic and societal structural transformation have dominated development dialogues in the South. There's also a loud call for support as developing countries argue for increasing access to vaccines, medicine, and debt relief. While COVID-19 has had a detrimental impact on our societies, it's also provided us with an opportunity. One, to be innovative and embrace different thinking to the traditional neoliberal approach. The theme of this year's conference, From Inequality and Vulnerability to Prosperity for All, recognizes the many challenges that confront us in the South. We believe that this theme is relevant for the times, laying the groundwork for meaningful outcomes. It is an appropriate theme, not only for the official UNCTAD conference, but for our Civil Society Forum as well. The UNCTAD platform provides a space to contribute to a dialogue focused on analyzing and addressing the requirements for structural transformation of economic and trade relations. It is clear that our current context requires new ways of addressing traditional challenges to confront an uncertain future. In these circumstances, there's a strong motivation for the UNCTAD 15 conference to be a game changer. Unfortunately, based on the draft conference text we've seen so far, there's much work to be done if this UNCTAD 15 conference is indeed to achieve a transformative agenda that our developing countries so urgently need. The objectives of this forum point to, one, the facilitation of robust and substantive dialogue amongst various groups that advances concrete recommendations on targeted thematic areas, the facilitation of an inclusive space which is representative of the diversity of civil society and which contributes to a comprehensive agenda for action. The other objectives, the advancement of a clear set of actionable proposals which build upon previous civil society declarations and is reflective of the current and future context of trade and development concerns. The agreement on future actions to accelerate progress and monitor the implementation of adopted policies and programs. Finally, the identification of specific challenges and concerns of small island developing states and countries of the global south that impact their ability to achieve sustainable development. The International Civil Society Facilitating Group was established to ensure effective civil society participation in UNCTAD 15 and the achievement of the aforementioned objectives. The facilitating group, in coordination with the Caribbean Policy Development Center as civil society lead organizer, has been charged with the responsibility to facilitate active engagement and effective participation of civil society in the UNCTAD process, specifically as they relate to the Civil Society Forum and policy negotiations. The road to this forum has been challenging. There were a number of hurdles that threatened the participation of civil society in UNCTAD 15. I cannot put into words the importance of networking, how contributions from many of the facilitating group members have led to this conference being a reality. The International Civil Society Facilitating Group represents a balance of regions, gender, and areas of focus, bringing with them a great deal of knowledge and networks to the process. Here is a list of all the members of the facilitating group. Asia-Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, Caribbean Policy Development Center, Friends of the Earth, International, Pacific Network on Globalization, Public Services International, Interagency Group of Development Organizations, IT for Change, Latin America Gender Trade Network, RED, Latino America por Justicia, Economica y Social, Regions Refocus, Society for International Development, Tax Justice Network Africa, Third World Network Africa, Windward Island Farmers Association. 5 thematic areas have been identified as priorities by the facilitating group. Major focus has been placed on the reaffirmation and strengthening of the original UNCTAD mandate. Civil society has recognized that UNCTAD has been moving away from its original mandate, the focus on closing the gap between developed and developing countries. For this reason, we seek a realignment to and a strengthening of the original mandate, thereby ensuring robust development agenda for all. Of paramount importance is climate justice, adaptation, and sustainability. The issue of creating a framework that supports slowing the pace of climate change while ensuring a sustainable approach to development has been a balancing act for many of us in developing countries. The unfortunate reality is that the jurisdictions with the lowest levels of emissions and development will suffer some of the most severe consequences of climate change. This, we believe, is a situation that must be rectified. The forum will also seek to address issues related to the blue and green economies and their role in economic sustainability, poverty reduction, and food security, especially for SIDS. Ladies and gentlemen, we intend to delve deeper into the strategies such as a just recovery, adaptation strategies, adequate financing mechanisms, and other resilience building initiatives to address identified concerns. With regard to debt and development, civil society is concerned with the rising external debt burdens that continue to absorb a growing share of developing countries' resources. The pandemic has worsened the existing situation of high indebtedness significantly, as many countries have been forced to retreat to the debt markets and amplify their borrowing to maintain healthcare services and social safety nets. All this in the face of notable declines in economic output and revenues. As a result, there is a need for a post-COVID-19 relief initiative for LDCs, SIDS, and other qualifying developing countries to have immediate debt relief to permit economies to tackle the threat of significant increases in poverty and inequalities within these countries. Furthermore, UNCTAD's current language on debt and development finance should aim to balance the need to reduce debt vulnerability while also ensuring inclusive and sustainable development for all. Having regard to technology justice and digitalization, small and medium-sized developing economies have struggled to manifest robust economic activity and growth over the last decade. They have notably lagged the developed economies in the use of technology as a driver of economic growth. The intensification of digitalization post-COVID indicates a shift that is here to stay, with transnational platform behemoths firmly taking control of the global value chains. We are witnessing not just the expansion of e-commerce marketplaces, rather, the platform model signals a deep transformation of production relations as data power becomes a proxy for market power. Without appropriate rules for the emerging digital context, the international trade regime based on the de facto flow of data from developing to developed countries is reinforcing and deepening economic inequalities among countries. As many decades of multilateral trade liberalization, developing nations continue to experience growing economic inequalities themselves. Today, we continue to support the UNCTAD 14's Declaration of Civil Society, expressing that trade and investment agreements do not offer enough protection and support to developing countries. We therefore urge UNCTAD to commit to reviewing proposed and existing trade agreements towards the amendment of language that is supportive of developing nations, and also to improve the capacity of developing countries to negotiate more equitable agreements. Having regard to the structure, this year's Civil Society Forum has taken on a streamlined approach to maximize audience engagement. 3 main plenary sessions, followed by extended discussion segments, lend themselves to an open and ample forum to distill thematic areas. 4 side events on the 3rd day of the forum serve to provide greater insights into key areas of thematic interest. The forum will culminate with a closed session focusing on preparing the declaration. All sessions will be available via Zoom. Audience members will use Slido to pose questions to the panel. This can be done from the browser. There's no need to download the Slido application, and we look forward to a hearty engagement at these events. The first plenary tackles the reaffirmation of UNCTAD's mandate. It will address the mandate and its role in the current socio-economic context. Additionally, the session will explore UNCTAD's ability to confront current challenges, particularly those facing the global south. Civil society is concerned with attempts to move the UNCTAD away from its original role, which is one for developing nations to raise dialogue and identify solutions on their development concerns, to one that conforms with traditional neoliberalization thought processes that favor advanced countries and are usually characterized by notable inequalities. The second plenary focuses on trade and technology development. Technology transfer and advancement are proven driving forces for macroeconomic development. While this may be the case in developed countries, many developing countries have not been able to tap into the benefits of the digital age. It is therefore up to policymakers to ensure that the benefits redound to various groups. In this vein, this session explores the issue from a technology justice perspective and aims to distill issues associated with growth and technology as they relate to the global south. Specific focus is placed on reframing trade agreements, international cooperation, building local economic resilience through technology justice. The third plenary session focuses on systemic reforms for fiscal space. This session seeks to ignite discussions on systemic reforms that can ensure adequate fiscal space for southern countries to pursue their development pathways. Topics of interest include human rights approach to debt relief and debt sustainability, tax governance, and also the importance of South-South finance investment cooperation. The side events on day 3 are intended to present more targeted focus on areas such as gender, taxation, the debt crisis, and just recovery, with presentations by our esteemed CSO colleagues. The discussion of the framework for civil society is the final event on day 3. This will be a closed session of a subcommittee of the International Civil Society Facilitating Group, which will be later shared with participants. Finally, I dare say that the role of civil society in global sustainable development cannot be understated. Our sector continues to make significant contributions to deepen the development and trade discourse by providing alternative development approaches and counter-narratives to traditional thinking. Let us use the UNCTAD 15 as a platform to re-energize and refocus development efforts and commitments. It also presents a unique opportunity for states, especially small island developing states, to respond strategically by reinforcing the value of multilateralism. The Civil Society Forum at UNCTAD 15 is a great occasion for us to use our collective voice to make sense of our reality and proffer solutions. So let us grasp the opportunity that's presented here. Let us use this opportunity to construct a path not just for sustainable trade and economic development, but also transformative development, ensuring that prosperity is not limited to a few, but is obtainable for all. Thank you, and I look forward to engaging with you throughout the forum and beyond.
Hello to all of you delegates and officials participating in the Civil Society Forum over the next few days. My name is Dr. Chantal Monroe-Knight, and I'm the Civil Society Forum lead. I'm just so honored to be able to welcome you to the Civil Society Forum. We have a popular theme song that says, if you can't come to Barbados, we'll bring Barbados to you. So it's really a privilege for me to welcome you also to the warmth and sunshine of Barbados. So whether it's morning, afternoon, night, whether it's cold where you are, just imagine yourself in sunny Barbados. I want to acknowledge that indeed it's been a difficult road. We've had to overcome some challenges as civil society to get to this point. But we are here because you have demonstrated your resilience and steadfastness to the cause. So I'm looking forward to 2 days of critical deliberations and discussions that are going to allow us to be able to showcase civil society at its very best. And even though we may be online, I'm also expecting that you are going to be just as passionate about your cause as we are if we were meeting face to face. I've had the privilege of welcoming you first but please, others will come after me as we seek to move this lever under the theme from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. Welcome.
Greetings to all. My name is Queen Ashiba Trotman, and I am the chairperson of the Ichiruganem Council for the Advancement of Rastafari, Barbados. I am indeed pleased to be part of the welcome to you, the participants, and the organizers of this, the 15th session of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. Barbados is indeed a beautiful island. However, we suffer from unfair trade rules and high debts. Civil society is an important voice to organize and centralize developmental projects and also hold our governments accountable for assistance. ICAR Barbados, as a grassroots organization, has identified food security through agriculture as a very important project to enhance the growth of our community and the wider community. Our eco-organic farming cooperative will continue to provide food, job creation, and promote a healthy lifestyle, all the while protecting our environment and coastal habitat. As we say, let food be your medicine, or medicine shall be your food. To our civil society partners across the globe, the sick must be cared for, the infants nourished, and the elderly protected, as we face some of the greatest challenges globally. I ask, please, that this meeting is not all talk, as the time for action is now. Let us be mindful of our theme, from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity. To all of you, blessings and one love.
We, the citizens of small and developing states, are in the midst of a crisis like no other. We face the shockwaves from the current global pandemic that threaten to undermine the social and economic fabric of our society, which coincidentally is occurring at a time when climate change is threatening the physical land space and the existence of the ecosystems that support the lives and livelihoods of our Caribbean people. UNCTAD 15 is an opportunity for everyone to simply and effectively widen their scope of knowledge, contribute to social economic policy research and analysis, as well as to create avenues for promoting meaningful global economic cooperation, particularly amongst developing countries that will redound to the benefit of all. Collaboration of this nature is the best path for us to achieve the targets set out in the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. It is my hope that you will earnestly participate in UNCTAD 15 to ensure that this critical opportunity creates dynamic and innovative partnerships that will help to move us from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity for all. Help us to resilience. We the youth want to stay alive and strive. Welcome.
Out of crisis and catastrophe comes opportunity, yeah, for real change in the world economy, to reduce vulnerability and inequality. So we coming together virtually to expand opportunities for developing countries. At UNCTAD 15, we're solving trade issues, youth issues and gender issues too. Civil society and creative industries are part of the call to bring prosperity for all. Small island, big ideas, much more than the beach. Small country, big reach, touching the world virtually. We might be small, but proud people standing tall. Creative and hardworking, we bring Barbados to you. You can't come to
For many countries, especially developing countries, debt is a serious issue that is affecting us all. Particularly in the Caribbean, we have some of the most highly indebted countries. In many developing countries, we are spending more than 25% of revenue on debt. What that means is that government cannot address some of the critical social development concerns. And therefore, civil society has to send a very strong message about their concerns in relation to debt and sustainable development.
From civil society here in Barbados, welcome to the 15th United Nations Conference on Trade and Development Civil Society Forum. As a small island developing state, our resilience and adaptability continues to be tested. Our current challenging environment has demanded the need for change to create agile and future-fit organizations, the adoption of an open government to allow for improved CSO government collaboration, and enhanced civil society-private sector partnership that could allow for economic growth through product and service delivery, trade arrangements, social enterprise, and other modes of sustainability, which for one, would allow for independence and lessen the dependency on donor and philanthropic support, which continues to be directed, and two, to be recognized as contributors to our economy. Parallel to this, there is the need for greater attention to be given to the appropriate legislative framework and the further strengthening of the institutional capacity of CSOs to be able to respond to internal and external threats, which in turn allow us to better respond to the needs of those whom we serve and to capitalize on the opportunities that will come as a result of legislation. Delegates, in your discussions, let's remain focused on what is important. Let us use the time to critically examine how civil society can be included to allow for the co-creation of solutions to localized and national issues. CSOs have a significant part to play in building back our communities and country, and therefore should be recognized as a strong and active partner in the whole of society movement geared towards moving our country forward, stronger, different, and better than before. What is clear is that CSOs are key in narrowing the myriad of inequitable gaps and a critical link between all layers of society. Friends, as a leader of a CSO on the ground, the challenge we see and face are real, unpredictable, and escalating. The images are harsh reality of unattended inequality, polarization, and marginalization, which has shown its face in the form of gender-based violence, poverty, unemployment, struggling single head of households, damaging environmental practices, inadequate access to technology, and other vulnerabilities and social ills that have been exacerbated by the onslaught of COVID-19. As you engage, let these images resonate with you and ground your discussions. As a means of ensuring that there are meaningful outcomes, I ask of you, let no differences or obstacles be greater than the cause. With all the time and resources spent to realize this conference in the midst of a very difficult environment, let this time be spent in discussion mean something. Let this conference be the flag bearer where CSOs' voices are heard, their contributions included, innovative solutions emerge, and collaborations forged in the interest of social and economic growth and development. Let this be the opportunity to develop the new blueprint for an open government approach that would allow for a new and improved civil society, private sector, government relationship to emerge. Again, delegates, friends, welcome to Barbados and make this moment matter.
In the context of COVID, we've all learned the importance of technology and digitization in order to allow us to continue to function, to work, and to drive our economies. But as developing countries, we've also experienced unequal access to that necessary technology. In the context of this Civil Society Forum, we want to draw attention to the need for equal transfers of technology and the process of digitization. Attention to the need. attention to the need.
Okay, the sound is now back. So probably there was a flex in the Wi-Fi or from your end. We'll also look at advancing climate and ecological transition, advancing transition towards a feminist care economy, and confronting the techno-structural and other issues that we are confronted with as developing nations. We'll also look at advancing climate and ecological transition, advancing transition towards a feminist care economy, and confronting the techno-structural and other issues that we are confronted with as developing nations. We'll also look at advancing climate and ecological transition, advancing transition towards a feminist care economy, and confronting the techno-structural and other issues that we are confronted with as developing nations. We'll also look at advancing climate and ecological transition, advancing transition towards a feminist care economy, and confronting the techno-structural and other issues that we are confronted with as developing nations. We'll also look at advancing climate and ecological transition, advancing transition towards a feminist care economy, confronting the techno-structural and we are confronted with as developing nations. We'll look at advancing transition, advancing transition towards a feminist
Out of crisis and catastrophe comes opportunity. Yeah. For real change in the world economy, to reduce vulnerability and inequality. So we coming together virtually to expand opportunities for developing countries. At UNCTAD 15, we're solving trade issues, youth issues and gender issues too. Civil society and creative industries are part of the call to bring prosperity for all. Small island, big ideas, much more than the beach. Small country, big reach, touching the world virtually. We might be small, but proud people standing tall. Creative and hardworking, we bring Barbados to you. If you can't come to Barbados, we bring Barbados to you. If you can't fly to Barbados, we take Barbados to you. If you can't get to Barbados, we get Barbados to you. UNCTAD, Barbados welcomes you.
Good afternoon. We are terribly where all the speakers are present. We apologize for the disturbance and the minutes in delay. There has been a technical problem, so we are going to start the session again. Unfortunately, interpretation will not be available, so all the session will be in English. We do hope you enjoy, and again, with apologies, I hand over the floor to the session to Stefan. Stefan, you have the floor. Moderator is not. I understand the moderator is not yet on. He is trying to connect. I would like to start the session and hand over the microphone to our first speaker. Tete, you have the floor. While we will be waiting for Stefan to join. Tete, if you could unmute yourself, you have the floor. And I see Stefan is joining. Again, our apologies for the disturbance. Stefan, I would like to welcome you to this session. And I hand over the floor to you, Stefan.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for this. As all, we thank you, UNCTAD, for your efforts in resolving this technical glitch that arose and which impacted on our start. We thank UNCTAD Geneva for your efforts in that regard. So we all clear that hopefully this problem has been resolved. Is everyone online hearing clearly? No glitches, so great. So thank you very much, UNCTAD, for clearing up this technical issue that seemed to have arisen from the Geneva end. But we nonetheless have it resolved, and that's the most important thing at this point. Colleagues, all friends, everyone involved, we are off to a late start, needless to say. So we'll get right into the topic. This morning's session is a very important one. It is the third session, the first plenary session that will focus on the crisis of multilateralism with the UNCTAD rediscovering its original mandate to confront key challenges of the global South. We have a very, an excellent panel of experts to delve into this issue, to dive into some of the critical issues that we are going to address today. The issues we are going to be looking at involved and surrounds the need for the balancing of the current global division of labor and advancing the socio-economic transformations that are occurring. We're also going to be looking at issues of advancing climate and ecological transitions. We are looking at advancing the transition towards a feminist care economy, and of course, confronting the techno and cultural issues that confronts the developing South and its relationship with others. We all know the importance of UNCTAD. We know the importance of the international civil society organizations. I need not repeat those, but we know that as CSO, we have a very important role to play in ensuring that the multilateral landscape remains, or that we strive rather to make the international landscape as favorable as possible for the developing world. I need not say much more on that because we do have on the panel, and please forgive me for any mispronunciations, that's purely on me, but I ask for your pardon for those of you names I may I may not pronounce properly, you can always clarify me when you come to speak. So we have on the panel Tete Ajayi. I hope he's still on. He dropped out earlier on during the technical problems. We have Diana Yahaya as well. We also have Alvin Mosjomo. We have Kayan Skeet. We also have Anita Gujumurthy on, and we have Daniel Bortosa. These are the 6 panelists that we have with us this morning. Just to give some indications as to how we are going to proceed, each speaker will have 10 minutes. I suspect that we are still holding to this time frame. I have not received any advice differently. So each speaker will make the presentations. They will be introduced by myself. They'll make the presentations. We are asking our participants, persons on, to keep your questions, hold on to your question and remain with us during this process. We want you to stay the course because the substantive presentations will be very interesting, informative, and knowledgeable. So we want you to hold on to your questions. At the end of the 6 presentations, we'll then have a period for questions. Those will be dealt with separately. So without much further ado, I do hope that we have our first speaker as scheduled on the agenda, which is Tete Homoku Ajayi from Third World Network Africa, to speak for 10 minutes. Do we have Tete on?
Yes, we do. I hope, yes, we do. I hope you can hear me and see.
Great, welcome. I'm hearing you clearly. I'm seeing you very clearly. Thanks, and we do apologize again for the glitch that occurred.
Thank you very much, and warm greetings to everybody here on the panel, and everybody who is participating in this conversation from Accra. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to contribute to this critical conversation. We've lost some time. So for the purpose of the theme of this panel, what I will do is to begin by highlighting what I see as some of the more fundamental aspects of the challenges that confront the global southern countries, African and underdeveloped countries, in the current conjuncture where we are. Then draw attention to some of the key and positive contributions that UNCTAD has made and its dimensions ever since it has appeared on the arena of international economic policy governance, and then end up with a couple of indications about how those positive elements of UNCTAD can be built upon for the purposes of the issues that we are confronting. It has been said many times, even just at this opening, that UNCTAD 15 is taking place in the context of a multiple and interrelated crisis whose sweep and severity is very unprecedented, and the implications are likely to be very long-lasting. That is nothing, it's almost taken for granted. For us in Africa and the global south in general, though, the remarkable features of the crisis is not simply that our people and countries have been at the receiving end of the extremes in inequality, both in the effects of the crisis and the response. Inequalities both among and more importantly within countries. Inequalities, whether it is related to vaccines, where I can say that people in my village, for instance, have still not smelled any idea of what a COVID vaccine is. But at the same time, some countries in the north are considering having third booster shots vaccines. Or whether or not about just the devastations that people's livelihood are facing. This extreme inequalities is something that I've been referred to. But I think even more remarkable is the fact that these inequalities are related and derive from the severe limitations that we've seen so far in the autonomy capacity for action in our countries and by our countries to pursue the kinds of measures that they could pursue for our people. So that whereas our governments are struggling around to take their own measures, most of the time they are having to rely on the international community. And relying on the international community, which have been making promises and delivering the very opposite for them. Again, whether it's in the area of vaccines, whether in the area of debt relief and things like that. Now, these constraints are constraints of capacity across the board, whether it is constraints in domestic productive capacity to be able to manufacture our own vaccines or our pharmaceutical products, whether it is the area of just investment in health and health products. It's also about the means that we have to raise resources, even if we have the resources different ways, to be able to meet the needs. And above all, in the policy space, the space to pursue finance, trade, technological policies that are appropriate for the crisis that we are facing today. Now, it goes without saying, as we all know, that these issues that I'm talking about in terms of capacities, whether productive manufacturing capacity, it's not something that have emerged only over the past, few years. In a sense, it is something that has been part of deliberate policies that African countries and the other developing countries have been made to subject to over the past 40 years. Policies which have destroyed their domestic industries, their factories, policies that have constrained their ability to invest in various areas in the social sector, in health and education. Policies that have made it impossible for them to kind of mobilize their resources that are generated in the economy so that they can reinvest them. Ultimately, of course, this is connected to just the location that these countries have in the international economy as primary commodity export dependent economies. But this is not something that our countries have not tried to deal with. We all know that for the whole period of the post-independent period, governments in Africa, all over, and Latin America, everywhere, have adopted policies to try and transform the situation they are in. It is on the onset with the neoliberalisms that all those efforts were having reversed. The whole idea that the primacy and supremacy of the market. So in a certain sense, the point I want to drive at is that if we are going to be thinking about just what it is that fundamentally African and other developing countries have to do in confront the crisis that we have to return to the situation of building domestic productive capabilities across the board, to build the means by which allows us to intervene in our economies, to develop the space of policy. Now, when I talk about the structural situation in which we are, it's not simply the failure of domestic policy, even though those things are important, but it has to do with the ways in which the international system and the international system of governance have been structured over the past 40 years or so to actually pose severe limitations of what our countries have been able to do or can't do. So when we are talking about rebuilding capacity in African countries and Asian and Latin American countries, we are talking about also re-engineering the multilateral system to play a much more friendly role than it has played for the past 50 years. In a certain sense, this is precisely where the experience of UNCTAD, since it emerged on the international policy arena for the past, since the 60s, have many, many lessons and features that we can learn from. And I think I'll just try and highlight two critical components of that. When UNCTAD emerged in the 60s, that emergence, some 20 or so years after the post-war settlement, the emergence of UNCTAD was an acknowledgement that post-war settlement we faced Bretton Woods institutions, the Marshall Peace Plan, all the things that we adopted then, even though they were very good at working, were not adequate to the specific challenges that most of developing countries, especially those who are emerging from colonialism, faced. Because indeed, I mean, given where we are now, we can look fondly back on the post-war settlement and even wish we had something like that, given where the problems of the global system that we have now. But surely it was clear then in the 60s that for countries that have just emerged from colonialism, whose participation in the global order were as primary commodity exporters, who were just exporting raw coffee, cocoa, unprocessed minerals, sisal and coal in exchange for cars and agricultural machinery and machine tools and even guns, that those countries were not in a position to participate meaningfully in the global order. And that in fact, the location structured for them very unequal exchange and collapses, very unfair terms of trade, which meant that ultimately their ability to even meet the needs of their people was compromised. So that what UNCTAD was offering as a challenge was the necessity to restructure the international global order that will allow those countries to move away from their primary commodity export dependence, which today still have been retained that we have now. Now, UNCTAD's foundational assumptions included a number of things which I think are key for today. The idea that industrialization was an important element for the purposes of African and other developing countries moving out of their situation. More importantly, that it was not possible for countries which are structurally different, located differently in the global economy, to assume the same rules. And more importantly, that it was necessary for these people to have differential treatment. Now, some of the most important things that happened is that UNCTAD did adopt some of the bold initiatives and bold ideas to try and begin to kickstart those assumptions. So the attempt, for instance, to make sure that the attempts around the international commodity agreements, whose main purpose at the very least was to try and stabilize the earnings of commodities that those countries were exporting, on understanding that those countries should be able to earn their own earning, be able to finance their own industrialization was an important element. And even when UNCTAD's attempts at international commodity agreements have not been successful, that attempt had a very catalytic effect in the thinking in the global system, so much so that the whole idea of commodity price stabilization and compensatory financing was taken up even in the IMF and the World Bank, so much so that even in the 1970s, the European Economic Community, today's European Union, itself offer export stabilization mechanisms in terms of stay-backs and CISMIN for African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries.
Hi, Tete. Sorry for intervening at this point, but just to indicate that your 10 minutes literally expired, so I'll give you 1 minute to round up, and then the rest will be made during the question and answer period. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm sorry that I took the time, but I was going to say that some of those focus on transforming the African economy that was presented was a very important thing that UNCTAD initiated. And that even in the period of neoliberalism, when some of those things became not very sexy and popular, UNCTAD continued to promote an alternative narrative for the international system, including the whole narrative, alternative ideas that have been published in the Trade and Development Report, not simply the Trade and Development Report, but also the UNCTAD LDC report, the Africa report, and things like that. Now, just to conclude by saying, therefore, that what I'm proposing is that the two things that we can learn from UNCTAD's history and UNCTAD's contribution is, first of all, the UNCTAD's capacity to provide an alternative narrative. That is important, especially in this area where the world has been kind of subjected to more or less the, shall I say, the dogma of neoliberalism. But more importantly, the idea that we cannot have one size fits all. But even importantly, that there has been some bold initiative to focus on the structures of developing countries so that those things can be transformed. Now, how those twin ideas are recognized in the mandate that's been negotiated now can take all manner of forms. It's a pity that I overspend my time to be able to elaborate some of the mechanisms of this thing, but I hope that we can pick them up in later conversations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tete, for deep presentation there. As we proceed, may I take this opportunity to advise the other panelist members, just remind you that you have 10 minutes for your presentation. When you get to 8 minutes, I will either send you a note or give you a signal that you have 2 minutes left. And it will also be useful to introduce your topic for the presentation. So I just wanted to remind you of that. Keep looking at your your messages on the chat. I will indicate to you when you're on to 8 minutes, and I will also make a verbal intervention at that point in time. I know we do have a lot to say, but in the interest of time, let's try and keep it as tight as possible. Our second panelist for this morning and afternoon, depending which part of the world you are in, is Diana Yahaya. Diana is a feminist activist, a trainer, researcher, advocate, and mobilizer. She has worked for more than a decade at local, national, regional, and global levels to undertake research, carry out advocacy and laws and policies, build capacities, and so forth. She has done an enormous amount of work on human rights and economic development issues. She has also authored several briefs, reports, toolkits, and publications on various issues, such as trade, economics, and feminist alternatives and demands. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Diana Yahaya. Thank you very much, and over to you.
Good evening, which is where I am from, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. As mentioned earlier, my name is Diana Yahaya, and I'm speaking today on behalf of the Gender and Trade Coalition, which is a coalition of feminists as well as progressive activists and organization really looking at gender justice trade policies from a feminist lens as well as from a feminist perspective. And within our coalition and within our work and within my own work as well, we've really seen how even before the current COVID pandemic had hit us, the current economic systems as well as policies were already failing a large majority of the world's population, and most acutely women as well as girls, and particularly women and girls in the global south, as well as other least and developing countries. And what we feel that the pandemic has simply done, only revealed, are basically these failures on a large magnifying glass. And we see this truly from the way the current economic systems, which has traditionally relied on, while at the same time devaluing unpaid or paid care work, a lot of which they are done by women around the world. The way companies who work or operates within the global value chain relies on the exploitations of women's wages as well as labor work as well as insecure labor to actually really reap profits from the global value chain. And then we see this as well in the way cuts to budgets and budget cuts to public services and public systems, which are basically institutions of state that women relies on more so basically to help lessen the burden of their paid as well as unpaid care work. And we also really see that in the way the vulnerability that women experiences as a result of other intersecting factors, whether it would be the climate crisis, whether it would be the extractions of like natural resources, the environmental degradation, the loss of access to land, as well as other forms of resources, all of which ultimately results from the current model or the extractivist model of our economic system. And we really do see that the only way we can challenge gender inequality in the world would actually require us to really challenge all of the economic policies, really unpack and look at all of the economic institutions and the accounting that has traditionally entrenched gender inequality. And this includes looking at trade, in tax and debt. And then it also includes looking at the roles of the different institutions, whether they would be UNCTAD, whether it would be the World Trade Organizations, the international financial institutions, the various arms of the United Nations, including the treaty bodies and so forth, and the roles of each of these institutions vis-a-vis one another. Specific to the role of UNCTAD, there are a couple of key recommendations that we do have, and I'm going to go this around three basic, large areas. The first is really in terms of the expansiveness of the work agenda or the agenda of work of UNCTAD on the diversity of issues that currently exist. A lot of these issues, I think, was mentioned just now, and I know will be mentioned by a lot of the other speakers during this panel. But for myself, specifically narrowing down on the expansiveness of the agenda of work around gender, will have to start by UNCTAD looking at gender in a more expansive, broad, cross-cutting, as well as interconnected manner that gender really is. And this does include having an intersectional feminist lens, recognizing that women are not all the same, and that race, ethnicity, your location, geographic, your country, your nationality, your urban and rural location all plays a factor. And it also does include moving away from this narrow view of looking at women issues or gender issues as simply looking at women's participation in market or looking at women's entrepreneurship. And then making sure or ensuring that gender justice becomes intrinsic in all parts of economic as well as trade policy does also mean that we do not box women or gender-related issues or gender equality issues into specific silos, whether there would be a particular chapter within negotiation or particular declaration, without actually addressing all of the different ways that the large macroeconomic system and trade system and issues and policies actually impact on women. And this really goes back to my earlier point about the intersectionality of women's identity and how women are not just women, they're also farmers and are therefore impacted by intellectual property around seeds, how they are workers and are therefore part of the global value chain, how they are patients and they are also impacted by the intellectual property around medicines, and then how they are also most importantly, users and people who rely on public services and are therefore impacted by austerity, budget cuts, as well as privatization of public services. And the expansiveness of this agenda of work would include and would entail in many ways to really look at work around gender that is independent. And so that means in many cases being independent to some of the existing gender work that is already there within the World Trade Organization or the international financial institutions. It also means being critical, which means also being critical with some of the agenda that is being pushed around gender equality, around declarations and so forth that are not really addressing the large structural issues of women as well as gender equality. And then to be also inclusive, which takes me to my second point, which is really around the inclusion of full as well as meaningful inclusion and participation of women's human rights organization and feminist organization from around the world in actually shaping, influencing, and making these policies and that are actually impacting themselves and their lives on the ground. And it does mean including women in all of their diverse spaces and identities as well as roles, and particularly women who are marginalized and from the global south. And we as feminist organizations certainly do feel very strongly that women's rights organization and feminist organization are powerful and strong agents of change. And we have seen this being shown and proven in many research and through the many long history of the work of feminist women's rights organizations as well as movements. And a lot of this actually will also include and will also entail the democratic participation as well as processes in the way all of these policies are actually made. And this also does include looking at the asymmetrical power relations between not only just men and women, but also between countries, between rich and poor, between all of the different multilateral systems as well as spaces that currently exist, and also between countries. And I don't think anything actually illustrates the kind of inequality that exists within how decisions are made within economic spaces than the entire conversations around the TRIPS waiver at the World Trade Organization and around vaccine equity as well as vaccine access, where we do see how you have so many countries who are openly supporting the TRIPS waiver to allow for increased access as well as manufacturing of vaccine, and just a handful of countries being able to undermine the will of so many other larger majority, even when this comes at the expense of human rights, including the rights of many women, as well as gender equality for many around the world. And my final point,
sorry for intervening. You're now on to your last minute.
Really? I'm only on like my 8 minutes, but okay. if you say so. So I guess my last point will really just to wrap up and say, as I mentioned earlier, that we can't really have any kind of gender equality unless there is a broad overarching transformation of our current system. And that means a structural as well as a systemic transformation. And that will not really happen unless we really address a lot of these different issues and really look at women's rights as in a holistic sort of like overarching, cross-cutting and interconnected manner. And we need a transformation where there is an economic system that puts priority and that puts importance on human rights, on gender equality, on our environment, on our planet over that of the interests of markets, as well as those who are the most richest, as well as the most powerful. And I'll just close by saying that only through such a overarching, overall systemic and structural transformation will we be able to see what we're mentioning earlier on around a feminist future or a feminist transformation really being, coming into fruition in the world that we currently live in. So I'll end with that.
Great, thank you very much for your presentation, Diana, in which you expounded on some critical issues, some of them dovetailing into what Tete has raised before, the value chain extractive models that exist, the gender inequality that exists in the global sphere, and pinpointedly looking at some of the issues on the UNCTAD, the expansive nature of the UNCTAD agenda, and the need to take into account the gender justice issues, the inclusive matter as well as the need for systemic transformations. Thank you very much for this presentation. We're moving on, and the third speaker that we have on the agenda this morning is Alvin Mosioma. Alvin comes from the organization of Tax Justice Africa. He is he's a founding executive director of Tax Justice Network, a Pan-African advocacy and research network of 32 members in 16 African countries. They are working on tax justice and curbing of illicit financial flows. He was nominated to join the Open Government Partnership as a member of the steering committee, and previously served as the chair of the Financial Transparency Coalition. He currently serves as a member of the advisory board for Platform de Protection, and is also on the coordinating committee of the Global Alliance for Tax Justice. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Alvin. Alvin, the mic is now over to you for your 10 minutes presentation. Do we have Alvin?
He's having problems connecting.
Okay, Alvin, are you hearing us? We heard you a while ago. I think if it was you who intervened there, or are you experiencing difficulties?
Alvin is not on the thing now. He says he's having challenges connecting.
Okay, thank you very much for this. Well, we'll move on to our next speaker. Sorry about that. Our next speaker comes from right there in Barbados. He is, it's Kyan Skeet from the University of the West Indies Gayville campus. So welcome, and Dr. Skeet is a trade research fellow at the Shudat Ramphal Center for International Trade Law, Policy and Services. Dr. Skeet lectures on research methods for trade, as well as regional integration and development within the Masters for International Trade Policy, as well as a compulsory postgraduate course called CARICOM and the CSME. Her research interests include CARICOM's Forward Trade Agenda, Caribbean regional integration, contingent rights, Latin American foreign policy, security studies, and regional governance systems. It gives me great pleasure to hand over to you, Dr. Kyan Skeet. Dr. Skeet, it's all over to you now.
Good morning, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Many thanks for this. My name is Kay Ann, and I am here today to welcome you, first of all, to Barbados and to UNCTAD 15 Civil Society. It gives me great pleasure to participate in this panel because I do believe in the ability and the strength of civil society to really advance development in our region and globally. My first point I want to state is never waste a good crisis. A popular quote that we've gotten from a former British Prime Minister, and it calls for us as SIDS, the small island developing states community, to take charge of our narrative, redefine our purpose, and clearly outline our contribution, not as price takers, not as being dependent on the world order, but on being big ocean states with a contribution to make in the contemporary trade rules-based systems. Now, starting very briefly, I'm an academic, so I have to be true to myself. There is no real universal definition of a small state or a SIDS, but we do know that there are approximately 38 United Nations members that are classified as SIDS, along with 20 non-UN member states located across the Caribbean, the Pacific, the Ames region, with distinctive social, economic, and environmental vulnerabilities. As SIDS, we comprise of less than 1% of the world's population, and that is roughly 65 million. SIDS are highly vulnerable to external economic and financial shocks, at least 35% more than other developing countries. We contribute on average 25% of overall trade in services, and SIDS exports on average, contribute to 25% of SIDS GDP. SIDS are among the most indebted developing countries in the world, and 4 of the top 10 most environmentally vulnerable countries in the world are SIDS. So we can automatically see that SIDS make up a significant portion of UNCTAD's developing countries agenda. I must talk about multilateralism, and I must talk about how do we survive this crisis of multilateralism, because we all know that in multilateral fora, rules are made to protect small states, reduce transaction costs, as well as predict outcomes. So it allows us as SIDS to know what lane we stay in and what we need to do to achieve development. However, within the multilateral space, SIDS have had to compete for attention. And what we have seen, and seen very positively over the past decade or so, is that SIDS have managed to insert themselves into this fora that make decisions. So we have the St. Vincent and the Grenadines on the United Nations Security Council, and they have brought to the attention of the UNSC the importance of climate change and the need for a global action. Also, we've had SIDS in the CELAC regional agenda push for a seat for SIDS under Troika, now becoming a quartet. As we look at UNCTAD, UNCTAD's work can be summed up in 3 very basic words. Think, because they produce economic research as well as innovative analysis. They debate by creating a space for us to dialogue as well as share experiences. But more importantly, UNCTAD delivers, because what they have researched, they provide practical applications as well as technical assistance to SIDS especially. UNCTAD is valuable for SIDS because they recognize the challenges confronting SIDS. And that is important. They support SIDS to become less economically vulnerable, as well as globally advocating for the need to build resilience in SIDS by providing advisory services, as well as, raising overall visibility. Thematically, UNCTAD's work on SIDS can be in technology and logistics, where they've assisted in creating service efficiencies, trade facilitations, as well as customs, investment and enterprise, as well as trade and commodities. And I must say, within the Caribbean aspects of SIDS, we have seen the work of UNCTAD by pushing the trade in services agenda, actually collecting data, allowing us to actually understand the magnitude of trade in services and how it contributes to our economy. So for me, from where I sit, going forward, in this spaghetti bowl of arrangements, as SIDS, we must continue to ensure that the work of UNCTAD supports South-South cooperation. And I will caution you that it has to be complementary. So it has to be complementary to our own regional agenda. And coming home to the Caribbean, our regional agenda surrounds the Caribbean single market and economy. So we have to ensure that there is a complementarity between the CSME as well as the achievement of Agenda 2030. Continue the work of UNCTAD in strengthening its analysis and research pillars, as well as resilience. For SIDS, we know we are vulnerable, and the only way to overcome our vulnerability and achieve prosperity for all is by ensuring there is resilience. We need to have resilience in every single sphere of our societies. And I will conclude by stating, two more points. The way forward for SIDS is that we actually lay claim to the vast areas of our exclusive economic zones, which is essentially the ocean around us. And that space accounts for 25% more than our actual physical land space. So we need to take advantage of that. And in concluding, I will tell you that SIDS vulnerabilities are permanent, unlike other states that can simply utilize several policies to overcome the effects of climate change. For us SIDS, we do not have that luxury. We are deeper in debt as we have to borrow to replace assets devastated by hurricanes, which leads to higher debt to GDP ratio for SIDS. And that is where UNCTAD's agenda needs to remain for the viability of SIDS. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. That's it for me right now. Over to you, Chair.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. You were quite efficient with the use of your time. Give us an extra 3 or so minutes. But just for the audience to recap briefly, that we had quite, again, in keeping in line with the other presenters, excellent presentation. The need for us to take charge of our future, of our destiny. The fact that UNCTAD is about thinking, is about delivering. It is also about, probably narrowing the whole technological divide that exists. The need that we must ensure that the work of UNCTAD complements the work in the Caribbean and certainly the work among SIDS, looking at our vulnerabilities and building resilience. These are very important messages that came through from our last presenter. Excellent work again, and thank you very, very much. We will proceed to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Anita. She is a founding member and executive director of IT for Change, where she leads research on the platform economy, data, and AI governance, democracy in the digital age, and the feminist frameworks on digital justice. Anita actively engages in national and international advocacy on digital rights and contributes regularly to academic and media spaces. She serves as advisor and expert on various bodies, including the United Nations Secretary General's 10-member group in support of the Technology Facilitation Mechanism, the Paris Peace Forum, Working Group on Algorithms Governance, Save the Children's ICT for the Brain Trust, and the Mindura Tech and Policy Lab Board. It gives me the greatest pleasure to hand over the space at this point to Anita. Thank you very much. Welcome. And you have 10 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you very much. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are on.
All right. Thank you very much. So I will focus on the acceleration of digitalization post-COVID in addressing the challenges and opportunities for multilateralism and the mandate for UNCTAD. The intensification of digitalization post-COVID indicates a shift that is here to stay, with transnational platform behemoths firmly taking control of global value chains. We're witnessing not just the expansion of e-commerce marketplaces, rather the platform model signals a deep transformation of production relations as data power becomes a proxy for market power. Tech stocks have vastly outperformed the broader market in 2020. Reports tell us that 2021 continues to be a record-breaking year for tech industry deals, mergers, and acquisitions. Without appropriate rules for the emerging digital context, the international trade regime based on the de facto flow of data from developing to developed countries is reinforcing and deepening economic inequalities among countries. UNCTAD's establishment in 1964 with a mandate to narrow the gap between the rich and the poor nations reflected a decolonization promise. Developing countries wanted an institution that would be their own poor man's club. Today, global digital value chains bring back a new moment at the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution, no different from 20th century colonization. This heralds an urgency for UNCTAD to return to its original mandate, that is, supporting the cause of an equitable and just global digital economy. In the modern world, founded on multilateral cooperation, never before have we witnessed a moment such as this. And this is not just about a world after COVID. It's about a world in which data and frontier technologies have rendered social norms and practices, laws and institutions anachronistic. The WIPO's 2019 report, the World Intellectual Property Organization's 2019 report, captures expert voices on artificial intelligence that note how, in a world where data ownership will determine who will be the leaders in AI innovation, a multilateral treaty may well be necessary to combat the global scale of potential disruption. The tectonic geoeconomic shifts because of data and AI, as experts note, may well lead to geopolitical tensions as nations that have the know-how to harness AI may commodify for a very high value the data of other countries' populations and ecosystems. What confronts us is a specter of acute inequality, which is why in 2019, WIPO's then Director General identified the need for distributional justice, noting the capacity gap developing countries face to participate and compete in the digital economy. More recently, in the UN Secretary General's report on digital cooperation, there were similar sentiments. The Secretary General's report observed that the lack of national oversight or governance in current artificial intelligence-related initiatives has meant that opportunities to use it for the public good are being missed. From a southern developing country perspectives, what are the key issues in the international trade and development regime that are then important for renewing UNCTAD's mandate at this historical moment? Firstly, trade agreements in e-commerce have become an extractive route whereby the raw material of data is taken away from developing countries by big tech firms. This hollows out the productive capacities of local economies, preventing developing countries from moving into the higher value segments of the global economy, leaving them at the real risk of deindustrialization. Conditionalities in trade agreements prevent developing countries from forging their own digital industrialization pathways. Development in the 21st century hinges on digital sovereignty and the ability of developing countries to maximize the public and social value of data and AI. Secondly, the platformization of production and market exchange is likely to roll back historical gains for women. For women in the global south, traditionally concentrated in agriculture and the informal economy, the future seems even bleaker, with new supply chains bypassing them completely. While the rhetoric of opportunity is often invoked for women in e-commerce, the reality is that the terms on which women participate in these marketplaces is hugely unfair and exploitative. Hyper-optimistic narratives of women in e-commerce must make way for more grounded epistemology. Thirdly, with the exponential growth of e-commerce and the increasing share of digital products and services in global trade, the moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions must be revisited. Without digital taxation reform, the fiscal base of developing countries will see a rapid erosion with cascading impacts for public and care infrastructure investments. Thus, in the digitalizing global economy, technological sovereignty for building platform, data, and AI infrastructures is the precondition for domestic productive capacity and value generation. The multilateral system needs to measure up and acknowledge the need for new institutional norms and rules, fundamental changes in the trade regime, tax reform towards digital justice, and reimaginings of ODA. National policy support for alternative solidarity economy platform models and social and care infrastructure are not possible in the wild west of big tech governing itself. The role of UNCTAD cannot be overemphasized in this scenario. To support digital industrialization in the South, UNCTAD needs to lead the creation of systemic capabilities in the South. Late last year, UNCTAD's Deputy Executive Secretary indicated in a UNCTAD forum that for a long time, industrial policy was not talked about in Latin America, but the pandemic has pointed to the need for the developing world to debate the structure of the economy, markets, and technology, going back to the basics of industrialization. The UNCTAD 15 outcome documents are worryingly blind to the urgent need for equitable digital industrialization. They run contra to UNCTAD's own contention on free data flows in its 2019 Digital Economy Report. The report argues that governments, both from developed and developing countries, are increasingly recognizing that the collection and processing of people's data cannot be left entirely to private corporations. The cutting-edge work done by UNCTAD on inequity in the digital economy needs to be taken forward. I will conclude by pointing to a couple of things that UNCTAD must do. It needs to initiate a new intergovernmental working group on trade and data sovereignty to evolve a rule-based digital economy where the data rights of the few behemoths do not unleash civilizational wrongs on most of humanity. That's when we are likely to have a digital economy with trust. UNCTAD also needs to carve out a technical assistance program for domestic digital infrastructure development and strengthen domestic data capabilities so that developing countries can participate in the emerging global digital economy on equal terms. Enabling South-South cooperation in digital industrial policy is another priority area. We've seen EU and other countries in the developed world make rapid strides through new laws, and all of this is centered on techno-sovereignty. The agenda of data flows, suitably valorized through terms like trust and confidence and introduced insidiously through trade debates, masks the laissez-faire economic order controlled by the powerful. Finally, a new democratic multilateralism is urgently needed for global norm setting and institution building so that techno-social life can yield a fair and just, compassionate and humane society and economy in which platform power can be harnessed for thriving local economies and sustainable local livelihoods. International cooperation is but a route towards this end and not an end in itself. The question is, how can a renewed multilateralism and UNCTAD's program of work move the needle to make this shift happen in the digital economy? Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Excellent presentation again. Very substantive presentations coming out of the CSO community. So we heard from Anita a number of critical issues. Again, some of them cross-cutting throughout the morning, issues of the shift that has taken place in terms of digitalization, the acceleration of digitalization, rising out of COVID-19 and what that has meant for us, the transition into the new platform, this digital platform for change, and the following, the critical issues that flow from that, issues of access to data, data security, data sovereignty, the distributive issue. In fact, it goes to the issue of information asymmetry, as happened during the current period of commodity trade, and where developing countries and trading organizations sit within this global value chain that exists, and how do we benefit from that. So again, very powerful presentation. Thank you very much for your presentation, Anita. So we'll now move on to our next presenter. Might very well be our final presenter if Alvin doesn't come on. So we have here Daniel Bertosta. Hope I got that right. He's Assistant General Secretary at PSI, where he manages policy, advocacy, and governance. He leads the PSI's economic policy working trade, tax, debt, and the future of quality public services. Danny has worked as an organizer and national officer for unions in Australia and the UK, covering local government and municipal workers, health and social services, education, and private sector service workers, where he led multiple campaigns for better pay and job security and against outstanding and precarious work. He was previously Director of Policy and Strategy at the Department of Premier and Cabinet in the Government of South Australia. He has done significant work with the Aboriginal Affairs and Family and Community Services. So Danny is currently the co-chair of the Steering Committee of the Independent Commission on Reform on International Corporate Tax. He's also a member of the Global Reporting Initiatives Tax Technical Committee, member of the Center for Research on Employment and Work, called the CREW, advisory board at the University of Greenwich, and member of the committee of the Center for International Corporate Tax Accountability and Research. Again, I welcome you and hand over the space to Danny. Danny, you have 10 minutes to make your presentation, which we all anxiously looking forward to. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And I wasn't expecting you to read out my CV, but thank you for the very warm introduction. I'd like to make 3 points today. Firstly, that a strong state with universal quality public services is essential for development. Secondly, that the current multilateral system is not enabling the state to play this role, and finish up with some points about UNCTAD's mandate. And I'd like to start by reminding everybody that the global north, the countries in the global north, industrialized under high levels of government intervention in markets, high levels of protection and high tax rates. Countries like my own, Australia, but also Canada, the USA, and all through Europe had high tariffs through their industrialization. They had state aid to infant industries, such as power and transport, communications, and infrastructure, and often viewed this as important for their national security as well as their economic development. They also subsidized and supported primary producers, either directly or indirectly via infrastructure and underwriting risk. And we saw very high levels of taxation through to the middle of last century that enabled the governments to play this role in creating development pathways for those countries. And it was only then, once the global north had fully developed, did they then take advantage of the industrialization and use it to dominate other parts of the world, and to and demanded market access into other countries and the throwing down of protectionist regimes. And they did this economically and also militarily, we know, but it occurred well after their export industries were already well established. We also know from our challenges today that it's governments and often not markets that are needed to solve many of the development and international problems we have. We know the climate change adaptation and policies needed are not happening fast enough, and the markets aren't providing these solutions. We will need state intervention in research and development, implementation of national green energy programs, regulating to shift away from carbon intensive forms, and also the social policies that are required to ensure that the transition is just. Markets can't do any of this, and they certainly can't do it fast enough. We're going to need government intervention. And the COVID pandemic has also showed that public capacity is essential when confronted with health crises, but also other crises as well. It's public health systems that are coordinating the public health responses to deal with these with this pandemic. It's public money and a massive injection of it that's gone into vaccine development, despite the myths that Big Pharma did it all by themselves. And it's public investment and intervention that has saved economies that have been shut down from some of the health measures. And it turns out that we can rapidly and massively increase spending and the sky doesn't fall in, despite the myths promoted by the IMF and the World Bank. And this crisis has also shone a light on the undervalued role of care in our society, and also those who provide it, who are mainly women and often migrants. And it showed us that care can't be commercialized. Care is actually a public good. And if we turn it into an economic good, we all suffer. those who are exploited to provide it, but also those who need the care. And we've seen through the pandemic that when we have marketized care, we've had thousands and thousands of preventable deaths. The price is very high when you turn care from a social good into an economic good. And all of this is to say that if we're to achieve our social and economic development goals, the state must be enabled to act, not constrained from acting. But unfortunately, the current multilateral institutions aren't enabling the state. Too often they're undermining the state. And this is causing a loss of confidence of people around the world. Whether it's investor-state dispute mechanisms that provide large corporations with privileges nobody else has and chill policy and rob us of revenue, whether it's the trade in services agenda and particularly the domestic regulations agenda, specifically designed to stop governments taking certain policy actions, whether it's across the board tariff reductions that undermine revenue and stifle industrial policy, or the intellectual property rules that have been mentioned that restrict vaccine production and drive up prices. All of these rules are designed to restrict what governments can do. And we've heard that the digital trade rules are doing the same thing. They're making it harder for governments to protect their citizens, difficult for states to control their own data, and they're written largely for corporations to access markets, not being written to promote digitalization for development. We see labour deregulation everywhere, as if a low-skill, low-wage economy is a sustainable path for development. And we also see structural adjustment policies, the constant recommendations to privatise, to introduce austerity, the IMF promoting public sector wages caps. And underpinning all of this is the need for revenue. At a time when inequality and wealth concentration is rising, the money is there to fund a strong state and quality public services, universally accessible to all, if we have the political will. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. But in 2018, he paid just $8,000 in income tax. Gabriel Zucman this morning tweeted and said a 0.3% wealth tax on the top 10% of the wealthiest, which, by the way, is a tax that Switzerland has, a country that is a tax haven. That's where our money goes, but they tax their wealthy. If we introduced a tax like that, we would make $3.5 trillion US, enough to tackle most of these problems. But what binds together all of these policies, and you've heard a lot about them today, is the prioritization of global capital interests over the interests of people, and the restriction of the state as a consequence, but also as a means to achieve this. And increasingly, it's not just the policies that are being promoted in the multilateral system, but it's also the policy-making process. And so we're seeing an increase in public-private partnerships where funders skew the work of multinational institutions by funding the work that they want, not the work that people need. We're seeing the so-called multi-stakeholderism, where even at the World Health Organization, we're seeing massive amounts of money from private foundations like the Gates Foundations that's coming in and influencing global policy. We're seeing powerful advisory boards in the UN system with business people sitting as equals to head of state around the decision-making table. And finally, we're seeing a very worrying trend, which is the squeezing out of dissent from these forums. And this brings me to the mandate recommendations and discussion. UNCTAD's mandate must ensure that it can promote pro-development policies, even when they're against the trend of the neoliberal orthodoxy. And the first thing that requires is the inclusion of dissenting voices. And I might say, as a member of civil society, we've been affected by this very recently. Civil society hasn't been engaged to the extent it normally has in this UNCTAD process. I'm not aware of a single civil society hearing, unlike in previous ministerial meetings, even though it would have been very easy to do that virtually. We got the negotiating text late. It wasn't until the 3rd of September that we saw the first official text, and that's far too late for meaningful input. Many of the most important issues had been nailed down by then. Secondly, UNCTAD must be free to play its historical role of criticising the current development orthodoxy, where there is evidence that shows that's the case. And the curtailing of UNCTAD's ability to present that evidence is completely unacceptable. And this means being open about identifying problems that exist currently in the current models of trade, investment and finance, including, as we've heard, increasingly the way that digitalisation is being used. UNCTAD cannot be just another forum for aid to help developing countries deal with a system that has rules rigged against their interests. It must have a role in showing how the setting of the rules matters to developing countries and also to workers. And it must have a role in showing what fairer rules would look like. And this, and I think this is really essential, also includes being able to point out the role that the global north has often played in creating many of the problems. The responsibility for the production of carbon and climate change is largely a problem of the emissions of the global north, certainly when you look at it per capita. We've seen with the pandemic how the IP rules that are promoted by the global north are stopping vaccine production, and it's the global north, particularly the European Union, that is blocking the demands from developing and also many developed countries for an IP waiver. In tax policy, we're currently in the middle of the most important reform to the international corporate tax rules in probably 100 years. And the OECD is creating rules that will raise more revenue and will tax some of the largest corporations on earth, but they're giving the taxing rights to the rich countries first, as if that was fair and equitable. We're also seeing how global value chains are designed to extract wealth from the global south, both from the labour force, but also through extractive industries in terms of resources and increasingly through the extraction of data and digitalisation. But they're leaving little technical transfer or social and economic capital behind. And finally, UNCTAD needs to be able to point out that although most rich countries have debt workout rules that are fair to creditors and debtors in the form of domestic bankruptcy laws for their own domestic corporations, we still don't have an equitable and fair debt workout mechanism for countries globally. And the list goes on. It is not acceptable that the global north, and I think the European Union at the moment gets a special mention here, it is not acceptable that the global north restricts multilateral institutions from promoting policies they do not agree with. That is not social dialogue, and that is not democratic. I think, and I firmly believe, and the trade union movement and PSI believes, that UNCTAD has an opportunity to make a meaningful contribution to the multilateral system that is unique and is vital for developing countries who are seeking their own pathways to development through self-determination. But if the mandate is restricted, then it won't be able to fulfill this role. And we'll all be worse off for that. In an interconnected society, in a globalized world, everybody will suffer if we don't have access in the global north and the global south to the policy prescriptions needed for all countries, but particularly the underdeveloped countries, the global south, to forge their own development pathways in a democratic, equal and just way. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniel, for your presentation. Again, pretty deep, very, very interesting presentation and question. Again, Daniel dealt with a number of critical issues. I just want to highlight three of them. Is the need for government intervention and the role of government in economic development, and not just economic development, but in the broader development scope of things. That to me is very critical. It is very important. The question of the commercialization of care and what that means for persons that engage in that. But very importantly, he made this point of the role of multilateralism versus that of the state, which is very much key to this, to the theme of this session. So this issue of multilateralism is a very important one versus that of the state, and how that unfolds, because we know normally the the narrative sometimes speaks to the enduring role of the state and its importance. But then at times the multilateral organizations, policies and rules and regulations can go run contrary to what some of the states would like to do. So certainly these are some of the key questions. So I want to thank all the panelists so far for your presentations, and we'll now transition to the other part, second part of this session, where we are going to be looking at questions. I just want to start by asking a question to all of the presenters so far, before we get going on to some of the specifics. So I think we'll have about 45 minutes or so for questions. So based on all that we have heard, your presentations, can you give us three areas or three things or changes that you would like to assist UNCTAD in reclaiming its mandate? Or not just assist, but what are the three critical things? Some of you have indicated that in your presentations, but as we get to this part of open discussions, let us ask ourselves, what are the three critical things we can, in fact, have UNCTAD to look at as we go through the reaffirmation of its mandate to a large degree, but a reaffirmation that allows it to transition into the current new economy, the new platform economy that is developing, while at the same time addressing the issues of the commodities that exist. We know data is going to be commoditized, it is already commoditized, but we have the traditional commodities, the cocoa, the nutmegs, the agricultural commodities. So we need to also keep that in perspective, because a significant part of the developing world still remains, if not all of the developing world really still remains, that of commodity trading economies, not quite digital. In fact, the digital divide has put us in a severe disadvantageous position, which is something we have to fight for, the whole issue of digital justice and where we go with that. So I will start from the open questions from where we started presentation-wise, and I will go to Mr. Tete, who is head of programming at the Third World Network Africa, and who has been involved in this engagement now for the last 20 years and deals a lot of economic and trade policy issues. So Tete, what are the three things that you would like to see UNCTAD undertake changes or maintain, and how can your organization contribute towards that CSO agenda? Tete, are you there with us? Yes, Tete isn't, but he is muted all around. So I will move on from Tete to Diana. Diana, can you chime in on this matter? Can you contribute towards this topic?
Yeah, well, I mean, some of it was some of the points I had already mentioned during my presentations in terms of like what are some of the aspects within the UNCTAD's mandate that perhaps UNCTAD is only very recently undertaken, especially the work around gender, which I would say is fairly new even within UNCTAD itself, that could be broadened and that should be broadened to really encompasses how large and how expansive that work around gender really is. And there are certainly no shortages of feminist resources, learnings, knowledge, experiences, and as well as expertise around how that sort of analysis and a policy that is truly feminist as well as gender responsive can be shaped. There are certainly no shortages of feminist organizations as well as movements who are happy to contribute as well as shape these sort of policies and how they impact on women at the very grassroots level, all the way to all of the different levels and different aspects of women's lives, as well as realities, as well as experiences. So I think as much as it is about what we are able to bring as civil society, and I think there is a huge amount of knowledge as well as experiences, it is also about how much access that we are actually given within these spaces to actually provide that same knowledge, experiences, technical expertise, analysis, as well as suggestions on the kind of like policies, as well as rules around trade, around debt, around public services, and many other macroeconomic policies, as well as areas, which unfortunately are right now largely being made without any genuine voices, as well as participation of feminist women's rights organization, and especially women on the ground, especially if you talk about migrant women, if you talk about urban poor women, indigenous women, women living in rural areas, women farmers, women who are fisher folks, and many, many other identities of women who are currently being excluded and marginalized from the way a lot of the policies are being made in many different domains, including to some extent within UNCTAD as well.
Great, thank you very much for that contribution. And we are going to move on. Alvin is not on, so we're going to move on to Dr. Skeet.
Thank you so much, Chair. For me, I would simply ensure that UNCTAD goes back to its original mandate to think, deliver, and debate to provide us with solutions. So continue the extensive research and provide it with innovative analyses as well as recommendations, because we understand that as SIDS, we have severe resource constraints. So if UNCTAD can develop our research and development component that we as small island developing states cannot do, then we can then take the recommendations from their research and find a way of enacting it within our very small public service. Ensure that within UNCTAD, we continue to share experiences. We continue to know what is happening across the world, and then provide SIDS with the opportunities to access technical assistance and create practical applications to help us with the trade facilitations, the increasing efficiencies in transports, as well as ensuring that customs in small island developing states is as efficient and transparent as possible. So that's, for me, UNCTAD has to be providing research, providing a space to dialogue and debate, as well as delivering for us by providing us with technical assistance. And when I say us, I'm speaking all about the SIDS. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Thank you so much. Great. Can we move on to now Anita?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I did mention a few things that directly pertains to what UNCTAD should be doing in a world that is reconstituted by the materiality of data, right? So I think that multilateralism, as all of us acknowledge, is in a crisis, and to come out of here, we do really need to bring back democracy into the heart of everything. The reality is that today we have the infrastructure, in digital society to deepen democratic participation. That's the direction where multilateralism has to go. So coming to the complexity within the space, when you actually look at the current text that countries have debated in UNCTAD 15, there are many, many red herrings, So developing countries are told, data flows with trust is very useful. So we are told that if only data protection and cybersecurity are taken care of, then all is well with the world. But the ownership of data, which is the elephant in the room, is really not, spoken about. Similarly, international cooperation is often used without really looking at the policy-making functions of multilateral norms-making processes. One also really looks at this kind of strange multi-stakeholder versus multilateral kinds of binary rhetoric, which don't at all, make sense for civil society, because we understand the process of consultation into which maybe multiple interests, can make their pitch or make their voices heard, is not the same as policy making, which requires a certain democratic representativity. And that is really important to maintain. And I do think that therefore UNCTAD's role, as the previous speakers have also mentioned, has to be very, very strong to lead from the front. It is important to do research, not look at capacity building in a very status quoist manner. You cannot build capacities of bureaucrats or even political leaders from the global south to fit into the same very unjust and unfair global trade and development order. You really need to be able to convert that into systemic capabilities, the capability to say, hey, well, if European Union is taking care of its own techno-sovereignty and digital industrialization, what about us? And therefore, I think to really look at very hard issues, including through working groups, including through focus on data sovereignty, assistance programs, South-South cooperation, data capabilities and infrastructure development, looking at questions of ODA, what will international financial institutions do to invest in public infrastructure building in the global south, etc., would be very, very important for UNCTAD.
Great, thank you so much. Certainly, I think we are at the crux where we are very much at the point where UNCTAD started, where initially there was this issue that trade would solve our socioeconomic problems, that once we insert ourselves into the global value chain, we'll be fine, and trade will bring benefits to develop, and trade would lead to development. Well, I think we have seen this, and you have alluded to that trade works, but it doesn't work in an even and equitable way for all. And UNCTAD has done a significant amount of research work back to Dr. Skeet's issue of where the trust should be. It is about, again, being that center for debate, for discussion, but also coming up with strong policies that the Seeds and the South can really hold on to and make fundamental changes and differences. So thanks very much for your response. We'll now move on to Daniel. Daniel, I know, again, in your presentation, you had a lot to say about some of the mandates for UNCTAD and where you see that going. But having now the benefit of everyone inputs into this and your own thinking, can you just probably chime in again with another 2 or so critical areas that you think, out of all that you have said, that UNCTAD needs to really focus on to change that global South divide, the North-South divide, and to move our economies forward?
Thanks, Stefan. A lot has already been said. I really support this idea of Kayan and also Anita about the primacy of the research and the looking at the systemic issues and providing that advice to countries that may not have the capacity to delve deeply enough into some of these issues that are moving very rapidly. And so one obvious area is providing that analysis and advice around new financial instruments and the way in which they're affecting governments, particularly as they raise their debt. And also, as I mentioned, the need for more work on equitable debt workout mechanisms. Anita mentioned the importance of policies for digitalization that have pro-development aspects, and I think that's absolutely critical. Even the most developed countries in the world are currently not keeping up with the largest corporations on the planet, who are bigger than many countries in the world at the moment. All countries need help to understand the implications of digitalization and what that's doing to their trade and development and investment policies. And I think UNCTAD plays a critical role there, providing some of that support. I mentioned public services. I think more could be done to look at the way in which public services contribute to economic development. I think people understand the importance of public services in social development, but public services play a vital role to economic development. The UN Committee on Health, Employment and Economic Growth said that every dollar that's spent on a healthcare system brings 2.5 times that amount in terms of economic development. And I think we lose sight of this sometimes. they also identified there was a massive shortage of healthcare workers and nurses, and most of those are in the Global South. We need to have a massive investment into training the healthcare workers that we need to enable those systems to work. Climate adjustment is a massive challenge, and it's going to permeate everything, both in terms of the transition, but then the effects of that and mitigation. And we've heard about small countries and island states. They are going to be massively affected by climate change, both in the ways in which their economies are affected, but also just the physical changes that will happen. And they need all the help they can get to do that. And I think if there was one point perhaps that wrapped all this up is industrial policy. It used to be a very important part of public policy, the way in which governments shape their own industrial policy. It's gone out of fashion, and I think that is a great shame. And I think UNCTAD could do a lot more in assisting countries understand the best forms of industrial policy that are the most relevant to their specific circumstances across all these areas: climate adaptation, public services, digitalization, and finance. It's all about industrial policy.
Great, thank you very much. Thank all of you for your response to this. Yes, so now we will go to some specific questions to specific panelists. So the first question we have here coming out of the WhatsApp group from the Civil Society UNCTAD chat, and this one goes to Diana. Diana, the question is, how can international organizations better mainstream gender policies into their economic work?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I don't really even quite know how to begin it because it's such a big point as well to be covered. But I will try my best. I think one of the key area when we talk about gender mainstreaming, or how do you basically make gender cross-cutting issues within a different large institutions or different divisions within large institutions and so forth, really need to start with an understanding about what gender or gender equality or women's rights actually means and look like. And for me, there has been generally a tendency to really narrow down women's rights or gender equality to just really looking at how women, in the context of trade, for example, women are either, participants or market, are able to access market, or how women are just purely entrepreneurs and whether they are able to access all of the e-commerce site or not. And I think that is perhaps one of the ways that is not the right way to start looking at gender as a cross-cutting and a mainstream issue, because it really doesn't look and address the intersectionality of women and that intersectionality feminist lens, which requires us to recognize that women are really all different in many different ways in different countries. Even within a country, you will have differences of women based on multiple aspects of her identities. And so to really just be looking at gender mainstreaming by looking at some issues such as women's access to market or e-commerce site, or even whether women are able to get loans to start their businesses and so forth, doesn't really address a lot of the other large systemic structural things which usually would deny women any sort of decision-making or exercise of actual power over how women decide their lives, over how our lives are shaped, and how our care work are being distributed and so forth. And so I think that's the first thing. The second thing I think for me is really, really looking at that care work dimension. And there is also, I think there was a lot of has already been said around care work as well, but I think it's really easy to sort of like look at care work within the context of existing public services as well as public infrastructure. And I think there's a lot to be said about really looking at care work in a much more broader sense when women, for example, look after their land, or when women, for example, keep seeds, across different seasons and share that with community, or when women pass down traditional as well as indigenous knowledge from generations to generations, which all forms part of this larger sort of like system of care, which have been traditionally sort of held by women and carried out by women, but aren't also necessarily acknowledged or factored or considered, for lack of a better word, productive within the larger economy. And so when you look at how do we really look at gender in different aspects of government policies, it really does really looking at all of these multiple different aspects and different identities, as well as different sort of needs, as well as realities of women in different countries and different levels.
Great, thank you very much for your succinct response. I will have another question. I think this question is going to go to Anita. Anita, the question is this: how can we model more equitable data policies after the first industrialization phase? And what would these new digital policies be? So issues of digital policies, Anita.
I think to start with, equitable data policies are often spoken of in a unidirectional way. There is a very, very big move currently to talk about how public data needs to be opened up and how public data is the backbone of future innovation. And this is coming from all quarters, particularly not just the activists in the open data movement, but also very, very big digital companies. And why? Because data about consumption in terms of our presence on social media alone is not invaluable data. There's so much more to actually be datafied, including aspects of the planet, oceans, the soil, crops, and so much more that, including, of course, digital sequence information, right, about genetic resources. All of this, when datafied, can really be the backbone or the material, the raw material of the future of production based on AI in the future economy. Now, this claim to open data from public data sets is being made everywhere by businesses, and developing countries have been forced to get into these kinds of open data, multi-stakeholder models where they are asked to convert their data sets into machine-readable data and convert them into APIs for innovation, supposed innovation. Now let's look at it in the inverse way. What happens to the innumerable stores of data, the data pools, the data lakes, and the kinds of data that have been that's behind the trade secrets and the proprietary kind of enclosures of big firms? So there is slowly a realization, especially in a country like India, which is getting into a non-personal data governance policy very soon, and our organization was part of the expert committee doing this policy. There is a realization that we also have to have a regime where the corporations have to be under certain access rules made to share their data. And this, of course, is an issue for deeper deliberation, but there would be many, many claimants. For instance, Daniel would agree with me that the data that labor contributes to Uber in the first place, for Uber to have its AI, is actually in the first place something that belongs to the collective of drivers. So in some sense, there is, we have to invert this paradigm, which is somehow trying to convince us that all the data that belongs to the corporations is proprietary, whereas the data that is lying around everywhere with communities is not for social and public value. So this is the kind of building block that we should start off on, and I think that there's a big struggle out there.
So much, but do not leave us as yet. There is another question for you on the WhatsApp chat that builds on the answer you just gave. So the question is this: how can we address the main barriers to women's participation in the global economy, especially in developing countries? And that question was asked to you specifically.
I think Diana made this point when she actually came in with her 10-minute presentation, which says, and I thought that's true, that we are here with opportunities, but the processes through which we can access the places of power often are not open enough. And it's really the collective wisdom of so many women and so many people with feminist perspectives that we bring to these tables because of our privileged access. And I think that participating in global policies to shape these global policies, there is only one way. I think it's a question of alliance building to amplify our voices, and without forgetting the other pillar, which is to build social movements and build the agenda narrative below. And so democratizing these debates on the one hand and making sure that these narratives are echoing in the lobbies of, such halls of policy wisdom, I think both are vital processes. I think feminists have also finally pointed out that alternative practices finally need to make their way to policy. And therefore, I think, particularly in the areas that I work in the digital economy, the ideas of alternative platform models and alternative platformized lives, which are not extractive and which are respectful, which allow for local economies to thrive. And these alternative models are also an epicenter of collective action.
Great, thank you so much. We'll move on to Daniel. Daniel, there is a question here for you. Actually, I'm putting it into your hands, to your space. Can UNCTAD help the global north, or can UNCTAD, hold the global north accountable for climate change? And what would be the examples of fairer trade rules international organizations can help set up for the developing world? Do you understand it, or do I need to repeat, Daniel?
So I think there's two questions there.
Right.
Yeah. Can you repeat them again? I'll just take down both.
Yes. So the questions are: how can UNCTAD help hold the global north accountable for climate change? And what would be the examples of fairer trade rules international organizations can help set up for the developing world?
Okay. They're both great questions. I think UNCTAD can help to hold the global north accountable for its role in the climate crisis, although I don't think it's UNCTAD's role to do that directly. I think what's needed is a better understanding of how these problems have been created and how they'll be fixed. And they've been created because for too long we've allowed large corporations to profit from producing too much carbon and not pay for the pollution they create. And that's a classic market failure. And it won't be fixed through market solutions. You can't fix the market with another market. It will require intervention. Now that's very controversial because, of course, when you intervene, there are winners and losers, and it becomes extremely political. And we've seen the massive amounts of lobbying that some of these carbon polluters have put into stopping these sorts of changes that are needed. And in some ways, it segues neatly into the second question, because there are a number of fairly basic architectural points in the current global trade regime that stop governments from taking the actions needed to deal with climate change. I mean, we're going to have to nationalize a lot of energy production if we're going to make the changes fast enough that we need. And that nationalization, that creation of public energy, is actually quite hard under a lot of the trade rules that we have at the moment. The market access and national treatment rules often just don't allow it. They don't allow the creation of monopolies, state monopolies. We have an ISDS regime that allows some of the worst polluters to sue governments for actions that they're taking to introduce democratic mandates to deal with climate change. Under these ISDS regimes, if governments change the regulatory environment in order to pollute less, but that lowers the profits of a large oil company or a company that's polluting a lot, then the government can be sued for those damages. I mean, these are rights that foreign corporations have that domestic corporations don't have, that citizens don't have, that that consumers don't have, the environment doesn't have, but foreign corporations have the right to sue our governments for their investments if we take actions to mitigate climate change and it affects their profits. And one thing that I think countries can do is cancel these agreements or establish a sort of a multilateral treatment for the cancellation of these agreements. Certainly the parts that have ISDS in them and that will mitigate against climate change strategies. The other thing I think that can be done for good policy is to have a proper public services carve-out clause. I mean, we have them for the military. Governments have seemed to work out a way without any problems to say, oh, well, if the trade agreement impacts upon my national defense capability, then it doesn't affect it. And that seems to be uncontroversial when it affects the military. But somehow they don't seem to be able to work out how to have a carve-out clause that protects public services when these public services are required to provide the health and economic development that's needed. So I think there's some of the examples, but there are many more. I mean, there's the data localization clauses that shouldn't be in these trade agreements, the domestic regulations clauses, that disciplines that shouldn't be in there. Governments shouldn't be restricted in their ability to pass regulations to regulate licensing or to regulate and they shouldn't be forced to involve corporations in consultative processes that other stakeholders aren't involved in. And they certainly shouldn't be forced under these domestic regulations disciplines to use the most efficient or the most objective. I mean, the policy-making process is always about weighing up the interests of various stakeholders in your country. Politicians are constantly saying, we will weigh up the environmental needs and the labour needs and the capital needs and the needs of pensioners and the needs of young people, and we create compromises. Yet what we're being asked to do with a lot of these domestic regulations disciplines is to privilege foreign multinationals in the policy-making process, and there's no place for that in my opinion in a democratic society and in a country that is seeking its own path to development.
Great. Thank you so much. This other question, it comes from the chat, and it will go to is it Kian or Kayan? When you come back on, please clarify me with the pronunciation. It seems like Kayan, so I will, subject to your redirection on this, I will go with it. So Ken, the question is, seals have traditionally been focused on tourism and extractive industries. However, in the COVID-19 pandemic context, online platforms and digitalization are forcing countries to change their models of operations. How can seals keep up with the current digitalization movement to remain relevant and sustainable in the era of rapid digitalization when they were already behind pre-COVID? And what is the role of CSOs in facilitating these changes? Over to you, Kian. Kayan.
Good morning again. It is Kayan. The I is like a Y. Yes, please. But I answer to all, so don't worry. That's fine.
Okay. Many thanks.
You're welcome. Many thanks for the question. So first of all, in providing the question, there was a statement that we have been technically behind. But what I want to do in terms of prefacing my response is to tell you that although we have been vulnerable, we have actually been very good in boosting our resilience. And we've acknowledged our vulnerabilities in terms of most of the sectors in our communities. So whether it be education, whether it be the provision of healthcare, we acknowledge that we are vulnerable. And in acknowledging that, we've also decided that we need to move the needle towards more or advanced development. In doing that, we have embraced a level of technology that I think has assisted our efforts in moving that needle. And so what we have seen across our communities is that when the pandemic has hit and it has exposed all of our fragilities, it has placed us, what I like to tell my students, at least 5 to 10 years behind our previous development goals. So we are now 10 steps back. We now have realized as a society that we need to embrace the use of technology. And it's through the use of technology that we have become resilient. So although we are many service-based economies, we have used technology to provide those services. So let me use my own case at the University of West Indies, for instance. Immediately when the pandemic hit and the lockdown happened, we went online and we accept the fact that all students did not necessarily have access to technology, but what we did, we engaged in South-South cooperation. So we had instances where governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, other states, all within the global South decided you need assistance, whether it be with technology, whether it be with sourcing sanitizer and other PPEs. We saw increased South-South cooperation, which again is a tool of resilience for us as SIDS. And I want to keep stressing over and over that resilience and resilient services forces is the way forward for us. Specifically for the CSOs, the CSOs and the community of wider civil society is grassroots for us. So continue to push the need for us to become resilient in what we provide as services. I like to tell persons in the Caribbean, we are naturally a resilient population. We just now need the infrastructure and the technology to continue to boost our resilience. So I think that is the model and the way forward for us. Thank you, Chair. Chair, you need to unmute, please.
Sorry, thanks there.
No problem.
I was about saying to you, don't leave as yet. We need you here still. There's a question that fits neatly into your whole scheme of things, and said, shouldn't UNCTAD play a greater role in helping developing countries define a global program on debt relief and development finance reform as a core mandate going forward?
Oh, most definitely. I do believe, and UNCTAD has a track record of showing or providing visibility to our vulnerabilities. So I do believe that UNCTAD is the space, is the UN organ to help advance for us why we need to have greater assistance, especially as it relates to debt relief. And I want to preface this again within the context of our vulnerabilities, because I mentioned in my presentation that we are facing climate change events, so natural disasters, hurricanes, etc. As soon as a natural disaster hits, although we have limited resilience in some areas, the natural disaster sets us back and devastates a lot of our national assets, which means that they need to be replaced. Societies need assistance in terms of rebuilding. That then sets it back for us as a people, because let's face it, we don't have millions of dollars sitting down in gold. So we have to borrow it from somewhere. And in borrowing the money to help recover and rebuild, it then means that our debt to GDP ratio goes sky high. So I do think that UNCTAD has a greater role to play, and it can play as long as SIDS continue to keep it on the agenda. Do not allow UNCTAD to remain silent on the fact that we are, one, vulnerable to natural disasters, and two, the debt crisis that we are all faced is not caused by ourselves, And picking up on a point from a previous presenter, climate change has shown us that we are not causing the climate change, the natural disasters, etc., but we are bearing the brunt of the effects of climate change. So we do need to have assistance. We do need for UNCTAD to basically not place blame, but explain the responsibility of the global north within the whole climate change disasters. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I have a question now that I will have all panelists chime in on, and I will, Deanna probably could start with this. So the question is this: do the panelists agree that given the current challenges facing developing countries, that UNCTAD should be commissioned to work with the WTO to do an overhaul of the existing S&DT provisions in GATT so that these can deliver real progressive development outcomes for less developed countries, and in particular, small and vulnerable states. And this will go to all panelists, starting with you, Deanna.
Sure, thank you. And if I may also just kind of touch a little bit on the earlier question that was posed to Daniel, which I think he also covered really, really well around the fair trade rules, because it does link a little bit as well in terms of the role that UNCTAD can and should play in terms of its engagement vis-a-vis the World Trade Organization. So the first thing I think that is really important to note around the current trade system or the trade regime that exists worldwide is how much they are so expansive that they are no longer around trade, which is the very simple act of like buying and selling goods. Nowadays, all of the trade agreements, whether you see them in the WTO or outside of the WTO, are so broad that they encroach on almost every aspect of our lives, of our daily lives. And I think that's really, really important to note when we talk about what would be a fair trade policy, when a lot of these policies are no longer around trade, and then therefore begs the question on whether trade spaces such as the WTO is the most appropriate space for these policies that are so broad and overarching and encompassing all aspects of our lives to be actually discussed. And so I think that's really, really important to sort of like note as we continue to other parts of our conversation. And then the second thing I think when we talk about what would be a fair trade rule or fair trade system would also really just looking at, there's this huge sort of like push on the use of gender chapter, environment chapter, labor chapter, and so forth. And I think these chapters fundamentally do not serve or address a lot of the structural issues within trade system, when in fact a lot of our governments are also parties to so many human rights treaties, mechanisms, and processes, which usually calls for higher standards than what you would find inside a gender, labor, environmental chapter of a trade agreements. And so I think it's really important for any future trade policy when they are being made to really look at those existing obligations that governments already have, whether or not these are actually contradicting those obligations that states have under all of the human rights treaties as well as processes. Which then I think brings me to that question around working with the World Trade Organization, which I believe is something that UNCTAD already does on a lot of the different area. But I think what the value or the added value that UNCTAD could have, and I think a number of other speakers have also sort of brought this on as well early on, is to really not be simply towing the sort of narrative, the ideological positions that the World Trade Organization is really, really pushing for. And I think this really ties into that whole questions of democracy as well as governance within the broader multilateral system. I think I mentioned early on in my presentation how not all multilateral systems are made equal, even if they were originally intended to be equal. They are clearly a lot more power, a lot more decision-making that lies within certain systems, such as the WTO, all of the Bretton Woods institution, than in other multilateral systems, such as the human rights, such as UNCTAD, such as the World Health Organization, and in many other institutions. So I think that asymmetrical power relations within this multilateral system means that decisions really just sits in one place. And within the trade domain, decisions have always sit within the World Trade Organization. And when decision could not move within the World Trade Organizations, countries simply took it outside and started negotiating all of these bilateral, regional, as well as plurilateral trade agreements. And so I don't think there's any question about UNCTAD, working or engaging with the WTO, but I think what would be really important is for UNCTAD to really be pushing, reasserting its power vis-a-vis WTO, for it to be actually pushing for the kind of position, for the kind of like progressive trade policy that really takes into account the needs of least developing country, as well as developing country and CITES country, versus the needs of a lot of the rich developed countries who really do dictate a lot of these spaces, such as WTO and the Bretton Woods Institution, and who have really been shaping all of the trade policies around their needs instead of the needs of least developing as well as developing countries. So I think in whatever form that engagement has happened and continue to happen, what UNCTAD really needs is to establish that the priority or the interests of developed countries as well as rich, powerful multinational corporations should not always supersede the interests of so many other people who lived in the global south as well as these developing countries.
Thank you so much. We will have the same questions to Anita and then followed by Daniel. Anita, would you like to?
Yes, I think Dana has spoken very eloquently about many of the points I think a lot of us on the panel do feel. The only thing I do want to add is that in the kind of multilateral schema, I think it's always very good for UNCTAD to play its political role, in terms of how it was conceived. And therefore, to always be at the vanguard of not allowing the mission creep that happens often in trade deliberations at the WTO. So I think, especially with respect to data, it's really been something of an effort in the past 3 to 4 years for global civil society to say that data policies shall not be discussed in trade fora, because that's not where they ought to be discussed. So in some sense, I think being at this kind of cutting edge, at the vanguard of bringing in the rhetorical, the discursive power of talking about the need for, data policies, digital industrialization, interests of developing countries and global political economy, and keeping that as the voice of the developing South would be very important for UNCTAD's mandate, which I think is not really, in terms of plausibility, really something that's admissible within the rubric of the WTO.
Great, thank you. And now we'll go over to Daniel. Daniel, you want to chime in on this?
Just briefly, because I think Deanna has said it extraordinarily well. It's quite hard to say it any better, certainly the points that she discussed. I'll add, though, just this point about mission creep. I mean, the World Trade Organization has moved outside of traditional trade roles, and what we're seeing is it imposing essentially competition policy, free market competition policy through trade agreements, and I think that is far too expansive and not acceptable and needs to be resisted. I'm not opposed to competition policy, but countries should be making competition policy relevant to the markets they face and in their national parliaments, so that if there's a problem, they can repeal their competition laws, not putting them in a treaty that they then can't get out of if they find that those policies are not relevant to their circumstances. And as a trade unionist, I need to mention Mode 4 in GATS, which the language, I think, talks about movement of natural persons. Most of us actually know that as workers and labour migration, and it's not appropriate that that's dealt with in the World Trade Organization. I think that's just another example of this mission creep. But on S&DT provisions and working with the WTO, people who are more familiar with the details of that, I think, can comment better than me. But what would be nice is if the WTO and many of those countries stopped trying to undermine and water down S&DT. I mean, that'd be a start. And also, it'd be pretty handy if the WTO and some of the key parties actually got on with the development round. We've been waiting for decades for it, and just allowing it to occur actually would be quite useful before they started trying to review S&DT provisions. But I'll leave the detail of that to others.
Or for another occasion when we will go deeper into those issues, Daniel. Okay, great. So I will now pass on to Kayan. Kayan, would you like to share your thoughts
Many
on
thanks.
this? Yeah.
Yes, please. Thank you. So for me, I would want UNCTAD to approach the World Bank and the IMF. The WTO is fine, yes. There is some overlap there, and I know that we're trying to get away from duplication. But UNCTAD, its work is around delivering, converting research into practical applications and providing technical assistance. So let us go to institutions where the problems lie. The problem of the World Bank, first of all, they need to change the measurement from GDP per capita when you are assessing and categorizing states across this world to a more multidimensional and comprehensive and realistic form of measurement for us. And secondly, to the International Monetary Fund. Because if we're talking about debt crisis and we're talking about debt relief, let us start at the very inception of the agreement. UNCTAD can assist developing states by ensuring that when the IMF agreements are negotiated, they are shaped and negotiated in such a way that they take into account unforeseen climatic events. So those are the two organizations that I would like UNCTAD to push its work in those realms. Thank you, Chair.
Great. Good. So, folks, panelists, we have had a wonderful morning. Great exchanges, excellent ideas for development, for certainly from the CSO perspective, it is very substantial stuff coming through there. We are about getting on to closing time, and I would like to give each panelist about 1 minute to share your own summary views on the issues that we have discussed, or if you want to probably touch on something that we did not touch on for the morning so far for the period, but has relevance to this current theme that we are discussing. So I will start with Anita. And if you can share your thoughts for 1 minute, and so this is the wrap-up section of our session. So Anita, the space is over to you.
Thanks so much. I have just one last thought coming out of my submission, which is I think that I agree. I think with Dr. Skeet that it's extremely important to think of the future of digital infrastructure, the public digital infrastructure that needs to be built in developing countries as a vital core of the agenda of UNCTAD. And towards this, to mobilize the necessary public finance, which should be seen as a right of citizens of the developing South. And I think this is a message that UNCTAD should internalize as a very, very important priority going forward in the next decade.
Thank you so much for that. We will then move on to Deanna. Deanna, would you like to share your thoughts for the last minute?
Yeah, I'll just really kind of like reiterate once again that I really think we need to be thinking about a wholesale restructuring, transformation of our current economic system from a climate change perspective and from many other perspectives of inequality, both gender, social, and otherwise. This current economic system has clearly shown that it has not benefited the large majority of the world's population. And so we can't continue, especially the planet, can't really continue on this very same trajectory that we have been for the last 3 decades or so. And I think the only way we can see a future that is more sustainable, more just, more equitable for everyone, especially those most marginalized and in the global South, is really to a wholesale restructuring and transformation of our current economic system and some of those institutions that runs them, including, I guess, for us to all consider whether we perhaps need to shut down some of those institutions if they have not served the purpose of the large majority of the world's population.
Good, thank you. Daniel?
I find it very, very hard to speak after Deanna because she so succinctly and eloquently summarizes the matters. I do think we're in a period of crisis, multiple crises. We've got a health crisis. There's always been a development crisis. We have rising inequality, and we're going to have to deal with climate change. I think it is the case that we've seen market fundamentalism take over and infect so many of these institutions. And I agree with Deanna, at some point we have to make some difficult decisions about whether the institutions are fit for purpose. We're seeing a lot of distrust amongst the community in these institutions. Most of us are multilateralists. It breaks our heart to see these institutions failing to fulfill their mandates. I think we need to do something about that. I'll just make a comment. Alvin wasn't able to join us. I think he probably would have wanted to speak about the importance of the current process at the OECD and revenue raising. He probably would have wanted to mention illicit financial flows and the way in which they are robbing countries of the resources they need for fair development and the need to make fair tax rules. At the moment, the rules in the OECD that are being made will raise more revenue, but they are going to give most of it to the global north, to the home countries, and we need to be very vigilant about that, because if those rules are locked in now, that's likely to shape the revenue outcomes for developing countries for decades. They are also trying to restrict countries' ability to implement unilateral taxing measures, and if that's the case, particularly around digital taxation, and if that's the case, there are a lot of developing countries who will sign up to that thinking they're not giving away much, but as the digital transformation occurs, we'll find that they've actually given away massive rights to tax digital companies for very little revenue coming out of this deal. And I think all of that underlines the need for there to be a more inclusive forum for the allocation of taxing rights and dealing with multinational tax issues than there currently is, because at the moment what we're seeing is unfair rules being reinforced in these forums. So I think he probably would have wanted everyone to be aware of that and to take that seriously, because we've got a few months before those rules will be set in stone, and at the moment they are very unfair.
Certainly. Thank you very much, Daniel. This latter point that you make is also very critical from the Caribbean perspective. The OECD rules and how it applies to the whole issue of what are called money transfers, the global task force that's established, our own Caribbean task force, and how these rules are basically being applied, and what has been our country's responses, certainly CARICOM response and OECS response to some of those rules. So finally, the final panelist for her final minute is Dr. Skeet. Dr. Skeet, I will give you the space before we get to the summary and conclusion.
Thank you so much, Chair. So I will leave you with a call for a South-South cooperation. We need to increase our efforts within the Global South to collaborate, to share experiences, as well as to trade. UNCTAD has to become transformative. And as UNCTAD becomes more transformative and inclusive, there is a need to move us from inequality and vulnerability to prosperity, but by increasing our resilience. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much. And just before I called on, just before we do the closing with Kizel, please allow me to just indicate the following. I think today's event has been a good one, as measured by the quality of the presentations that we have heard, its content, its directional purpose, and its transformative content. I think we have gone a long way. It has taken us quite a bit to get to this point, but we are here. The question that faces us as international CSOs is where do we go from here? Given this richness of what was produced today, what do we do with it? And how do we use it as a catalyst for the furtherance of fundamental transformative change that we are talking about? It therefore would require us to disseminate this information broadly and widely, not just to our sister organizations and brother organizations, but also to all organizations, including member states of the UNCTAD. We need to get the message out. And I certainly want to compliment the CPDC and the Barbados colleagues out there for putting in a significant amount of work in getting us to where we are, in organizing today's event. The issue of trade and the role of UNCTAD in that has always been one of critical importance for us, not just for the global north, but for the global south and trading nations. We are at a critical juncture in human development and in economic development for South-South. We have allowed ourselves as developing countries and at seed, and I deliberately use the word allow ourselves, to go through various paths and to accept and adopt and embrace different economic models that were not germane to us, but that was given to us. We are now transitioning from a sort of agricultural, tourism, trade economy to one that is driven heavily by digitalization, where the digital sector, the platform economy is where we are going to be leapfrogging from. The challenge that we have today, or the challenges that we face today, are not really fundamentally different from the challenges we had since the formation of UNCTAD. But what is different this time around is the information that we have available to us and the specter and the opportunities for inserting ourselves and infusing our ideas into the change agenda to be the change that we want to see. And I think this is where we are challenged, really, to be the change that we want to be. And CSO will have to continue will have to continue to battle on, to find themselves around that table, that decision-making table at the highest level. And we have to continuing to refine our strategies, both at the national level, regional and international level, to get our voices in to that decision-making channel. We need to be there, and we need to have our changes on the table, have it discussed, rationalized, and implemented, which is what UNCTAD is really all about. So on this note, I want to end my bit by thanking the CPDC and all the members of the committee for getting us to where we are today. But to do better justice to this thank you, I will call upon no other one but Mrs. Cosell Fraser, who is from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. She is a regional coordinator of the Windward Islands Farmers Association, WINFA. She has significant experience in working as an economist in the agricultural sector, a lobbyist, and an advocate. She's passionate about endogenous development of the Caribbean and Latin America region. And she's here to extend our thank you to all the participants and for all those who are listening into today's discussion and participated in some way or the other. So I now turn over the space to Ms. Cosell Fraser. Cosell, the space is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for those kind words. I would like to join with you, and on behalf of the CPDC and the organizing committee, I want to say a heartfelt thank you to everyone who has contributed to the successful execution of this first plenary session, the crisis of multilateralism. Specifically, I'd like to thank UNCTAD for creating the space for this CSO dialogue and engagement. To your team in Geneva and Barbados, they've done a fantastic job, even with helping us to sort out the technology necessary for us to have such a successful meeting on this platform. To our team of panelists, Tete, Kayan, Diana, Danielle, Anita, and even Alvin for his preparation, although he didn't get to really present this morning. Thank you so very much, panelists, for providing the intellectual content that has really provoked a lot of thought, stimulated the discussions, and of course, for the recommendations that you have presented here this morning for UNCTAD and how we move forward towards the sustainable development of our regions. To you, Dr. Fletcher, for your astute moderation for this session, thank you so very much for your competence. And again, I want to thank everyone so much for your contribution. Now, our next session, just to alert everyone that we continue this engaging dialogue and meeting that we're having for the rest of the week. Our next session will be tomorrow morning. We start 1 hour earlier So we would begin at 7:30 opposed to 8:30. And that session would be session 4. It would be the second plenary session, and it would be specifically targeting trade, technology, and development, reframing the discourse. Please, everyone, we beg you, we implore you to stay committed to this process, as Chantal has so diligently requested earlier. Let's bring the passion to these deliberations and really do justice to the development of our region. That session will be moderated by Deborah James. We look forward to seeing her tomorrow as she introduces the panel. You can be assured that you would have a panel of very enthused and engaging discussions tomorrow as well. So thank you all so very much.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, everyone, again, finally, and to the team in Barbados, CPDC team, for a job well done, excellent work. Compliments compliments thoughts to the UNCTAD team. We had a late start, but you were able to clear that glitch that took place, and to ensure that we had successful discussions. To everyone, thank you, and have a wonderful evening, night, afternoon, wherever you are, whichever part of the world you are in, and looking forward to continuing participation in the other activities during this week. Thank you, bye, and all the best.
Out of crisis and catastrophe comes opportunity, yeah. For real change in the world economy, to reduce vulnerability and inequality. So we coming together virtually to expand opportunities for developing countries. At UNCTAD 15, resolving trade issues, youth issues, and gender issues too. Civil society and creative industries are part of the call to bring prosperity for all. Small island, big ideas, much more than the beach. Small country, big reach, touching the world virtually. We might be small, but proud people standing tall. Creative and hardworking, we bring Barbados to you. You can't come to Barbados, we bring Barbados to you. If you can't fly to Barbados, we take Barbados to